The Dragon King's Baby, by Mary T. Williams. A romancely.com story. Blurb. A dragon shifter, marriage of convenience, pregnancy romance story. Addie's world turns upside down when her father announces her arranged marriage to the dragon shifter king, Wyvern. It's a union designed for political convenience rather than love, a bridge to build the gap between humans and dragons. But it's all at the expense of Addie's personal desires. And now she's told that she needs to bear Wyvern's child as soon as possible. Yet when she finally meets Wyvern, her resistance begins to crumble in the face of his commanding presence. Seduced by the intense passion he awakens in her, Addie finds herself pregnant and falling hard for the Dragon King. Yet there are forces at play, determined to ruin their union and newfound joy, even if it means plunging into war. As Addie and Wyvern navigate these treacherous waters, can their growing love withstand the looming threats of a potential conflict? Discover now in this paranormal, Dragon Shifter romance novel, by Mary T. Williams. Chapter 1. Princess Adelaide sat on the balcony that jutted out of her royal suite. She looked out over her father's kingdom, content with her life. The skyscraper in which she, her parents, the king and queen of the human kingdom, Lamina, lived was the tallest building, and her line of sight extended for miles and miles. Lamina sat safe on an island surrounded by the ocean. Addie, as she was more familiarly called, couldn't see the mainland, so large was the island. The skyscraper in which she resided with her family, a battalion of servants, and royal courtiers sat in the middle of the island and was protected by a contingent of human soldiers. A knock sounded at her door, and Addie turned her head to call out. Her handmaid and close friend, Jean, entered without waiting for an answer, bustling in with a tray of food, holding her breakfast. "Good morning, Addie," Jean called in her sweet, high-pitched voice. She set the tray down, and as was customary for the pair, sat across from Addie to join her in her repast. "Good morning, Jean." "Thank you," Addie replied, handing her friend a napkin from the tray before pouring them each a cup of coffee. As she divided the food, a note on the tray caught her eye. "Who's the note from?" Jean rolled her eyes. "Thomas met me in the kitchen and asked that I give this to you." Thomas was the king's second in command, sort of a vice president type figure. Such formality, Addie mused aloud. She put a piece of fruit in her mouth, enjoying the succulent sweetness, before she opened the note. Her eyebrow lifted. "I've been summoned to his office." "Really?" Jean asked, glancing sideways at the note Addie had dropped on the tray. "How weird that he asked you like that." Addie sighed. "He only does this when he has something to talk to me about that he knows I won't like. I can't ignore a formal summons, but I can skip dinner." They laughed together. Jean hummed in thought. She chewed on a hunk of cantaloupe and swallowed before saying, "I wonder what he could possibly want." "Who knows? The last time he summoned me like this, it was to tell me that I had to go to college whether I liked it or not." "Yeah, but you wanted to go to college, so that doesn't really count," Jean reminded her as she speared a piece of watermelon with her fork. "True, even though he insisted my major be in foreign diplomacy rather than literature," Addie grumbled. "You minored in literature and have written and published several short stories." Addie nodded thoughtfully as she sipped her coffee. "I still wonder if they published them just because I'm the king's daughter." "No way," Jean assured her. "I read them. They're really good." "You have to say that." "You're my friend," Addie returned with a grin. "Anyway, I can't imagine what he wants." "Well, let's finish breakfast so you can choose what to wear." "You might as well look your best when you go down to meet him," Jean commented. Addie cut into her omelette fiercely, scraping the plate with her fork and causing both herself and Jean to shudder at the sound. "Sorry. You know, he could just come up here or talk to me at dinner, but no. That's why I'm kind of freaking out right now." Jean waved her empty fork around. "I wouldn't worry about it until you get there." "Yeah, I guess." Addie changed the subject. "Any gossip I need to know about?" Jean giggled and launched into a 10-minute discussion about one of her father's aides who had been caught dilly-dallying with a big no-no among the humans. Addie's worries about her father's desire to meet with her melted away as she listened to the newest scandal. Addie descended alone in the elevator, dressed in the dove-gray pantsuit Jean had chosen for her, assuming her father had called her to his office to discuss a business matter. Addie had admired herself in the mirror after putting the suit on. Her ample bosoms and generous curves filled the suit as if it had been tailored for her, which, of course, it had been. She'd asked Jean to pull her hair up in a professional-looking updo and had put on minimal makeup. The soft fabric of her suit felt smooth under her hands as she ran her hands over her clothes and hair just before the elevator door opened. She stepped into the foyer that led to her father's office. The opulence was understated, but it was there in the stainless steel and glass, the original art hanging on the walls, and the polished older woman behind the desk waiting to greet her father's guests. "Good morning, Adelaide," the woman greeted, standing as she spoke in a show of respect for a member of the royal family. Her gray hair was perfectly coiffed, her clothes immaculate, and although she was her father's secretary, Addie knew she held a great deal of power. "Good morning, Ginger," Addie replied, inwardly grinning at the almost silly name for such an elegant woman. "Is my father ready to see me?" "Yes, dear," Ginger replied. She stepped around her desk to stand close to Addie. She leaned in and whispered, "Your father and Thomas are in there. I don't know what's going on, but it's big." Addie's stomach clenched. If Ginger felt it was necessary to warn her, she was in trouble. She took Ginger's hand and squeezed it, hoping to gather some of the woman's strength. "Thank you, Ginger. I hope I'm not in trouble." Ginger looked at her, her face pinched with concern. "I'll be here if you need me. Your mother also told me to tell you to come see her as soon as this meeting is over." Dear gods. This must be something awful. Addie thought, but her face didn't show her worry. She'd learned from an early age to keep her thoughts from crossing her face unless she wanted them to be known. She smiled at Ginger. "Well, here goes." Addie put her hand on the door, took a deep, calming breath meant to ease the stressful tension in her body, and pushed the door open. Her father and Thomas, his second in command, rose when she entered. She looked around the room, the men were alone. Her father, King George, never included anyone in private family business. This was something else. "Addie, come on in," George called to her. She realized she'd been standing at the door, thoughts in disarray, staring at her father and Thomas. She put a smile on her face and stepped in, listening to the swish of the door as it closed behind her. She felt trapped by the sound and the men's eyes as they watched her cross the plush, white rug and take a seat. Her father had chosen to sit at the head of the conference table with Thomas on his right. He rose to kiss her cheek chastely and gestured that she sit to his left. Again she felt serious concern. He never made her sit at the table like an associate. Normally, they sat on the leather couch and comfortable chairs he had in his office. Her nerves were on fire, especially when her father grinned at her like a cat with a mouse in its sights. "Addie, I have something very important to speak to you about this morning," George began. "Why is Thomas here?" Addie asked abruptly. She looked at Thomas apologetically. "I'm sorry, Thomas." "No offense, Addie," Thomas said with a small, almost uncomfortable smile. "You're not used to such formal meetings." "No, which makes me wonder what this is about," Addie said, looking back to her father with an eyebrow raised. "Addie, how old are you?" Addie's eyes narrowed and she pursed her lips. Her father knew the answer to that question. "I'm 27. 27. "Perfect," George murmured, nodding at Thomas. "Father, pardon my language, but what the hell is going on?" "You know how old I am," Addie said, glaring at her father. George's smile broadened, and he looked absolutely delighted by her question. "I've made a wonderful arrangement for you." "Arrangement?" The word frightened her. "What kind of arrangement?" George took a deep breath, a sign that he wasn't expecting this to go well once he made his announcement. But he was pretending he thought she'd be happy. You are getting married. Silence permeated the room. Addie's breath had stopped, her pulse hammered, and she felt a little faint. After several moments, she found her voice again. Excuse me? I don't think I heard you correctly. George and Thomas exchanged a glance. George sat forward and reached for Addie's hand, but she pulled it away before he could touch her. Again, the men looked at each other, and George sighed heavily, his false happiness evaporating. Addie, I promised that you will marry the Dragon King. The king wished for the silence of earlier. Addie leapt to her feet and yelled, Are you kidding me? The Dragon King? You promised me to someone without even asking for my opinion in the matter? Addie, unfortunately, your opinion holds no sway in matters of foreign policy. Addie's eyes jerked to Thomas, who cleared his throat before continuing. An alliance with the Dragon King and his kingdom is required for our safety and theirs. The best alliance is a marriage. Thomas finished his explanation by lifting his hands in a gesture filled with helpless resignation. An alliance? Addie looked at her father. Let me get this straight. Are you selling me to the Dragon King so that he'll be on your side should a war break out? Am I a whore you are pimping out? Adelaide, her father bellowed, rising to his feet as well. Do not use that language when speaking to the king. Addie bowed sarcastically. My apologies, Your Royal Highness. I thought I was having a conversation with my father. George breathed in. All right. We need to calm down. He returned to his seat and gestured for his daughter to do the same. Please, sit down. Addie lowered herself onto the edge of the chair, her back straight and prepared to fight against this decision. In a calmer voice filled with suppressed fury, she stated, Father, I do not want to marry anyone, let alone a man I've never met, especially a man who is of a different species. That's never been done before. You're right, Addie. It's never been done before by our family or the Dragon King's family. But many commoners of all species are married to a person of a different species. And even have children. Addie's lip curled in derision. Is that a not-so-subtle hint, Father? Am I supposed to get knocked up as soon as possible? Eager for grandchildren, are you? It's the only way to solidify the alliance. Thomas spoke, but did not meet her eyes. Well, God forbid love have anything to do with it, Addie replied sarcastically, her eyes shooting daggers at Thomas, then her father. I will not marry. I will not bear the child of a man I do not know nor love. George sat up. His demeanor changed to that of a king rather than the man who had thrown her into the air as a child. Adelaide, you will marry. You will marry the Dragon King, you will move to Wyvern, and you will produce an heir within the year. I have to move to the Dragon Kingdom? Leave behind everything I know, my family, my friends, my life. Father, this is absurd, backwards, and completely unfair. Addie was close to tears, her voice hitching by the end of her sentence. She blinked once, the tears were gone, replaced by anger once again. George softened as he watched his daughter's display of strength. I'm sorry, Addie, but this is the way of things when you are a member of the royal family. The wizards have wed into the royal line and created an alliance. They are stronger than us now. We have no choice. Addie rose. You mean I have no choice but to submit to this absolutely preposterous marriage? If that's the way you choose to see it, then yes, I suppose so. Her father rose again and handed her some papers. The wedding will take place a week from tomorrow. He ignored his daughter's gasp of indignation. Your mother is aware of this and has already begun preparing. I suggest you join her. Have you met the Dragon King? Addie asked. George would not meet her eyes. No. Addie was silent, her fury filling the room with each passing second. The papers in her hand were crumpled in her fury. But I'm supposed to marry him, Addie hissed. She shook her head. And when do I have to move? She asked scathingly. The day after the wedding, George said. Addie stared at him, hatred plain on her face. Thomas cleared his throat. Gently, he said, Addie, the papers you're holding are a contract. I'll need you to sign that before you leave the office. Her eyes didn't leave her father's as she said, of course. I'll sign my freedom away and bind myself to a man I've never laid eyes on. A man my father has never met. I'll give myself to this man who may or may not be a mean son of a bitch. Addie jerked the proffered pen out of Thomas's hand and signed the line he pointed at with a flourish. She slammed the pen on the table and lifted her eyes to her father's. I will never forgive you for this. And any child of mine will never visit this kingdom. I will never return to this kingdom. Next week will be the last time you will lay eyes on me. She refused to look at Ginger as she marched out of the office. She'd wanted to slam the door, but she was unable because of the stopper. She pushed the elevator button with such anger she hurt her finger. Ginger watched her, but did not speak. The pain Addie felt was plain on her face and in her stance. As soon as the elevator doors closed, she broke down, sobbing so hard her body put itself into the fetal position. She braced herself in the corner of the elevator and let the tears rack her body. She'd chosen the floor that would open into her mother's private rooms, and she was standing there, waiting for her daughter with Jean as well as Addie's best friend, Poppy. Addie, her mother gushed. She rushed into the elevator and helped her daughter back to her feet. With her arm around her, she guided her to the couch closest to the window, where her daughter had always liked to sit. Sweetheart, I'm so sorry for the suddenness of this. The suddenness? Addie sobbed, looking at her mother, her words garbled by tears. This is positively the most appalling thing that's ever happened to me. I know, baby, I know, Claire murmured, soothing her daughter's hair as her friends circled around her. Addie, Poppy and I get to go with you to Wyvern, so you won't be totally alone, Jean told her as her hand ran down her sobbing friend's arm. Addie frowned as she looked at her friend. That's not fair. You two have to give up your lives here to go with me? We don't see it that way, Poppy explained. We're excited to see new places and new things. We volunteered to go with you to help you. Addie stared at her fairy friend, absorbing the comfort she always exuded. Her little body, only a couple of feet high, flitted about, her fairy wings moving so quickly they looked like a blur of pink. Her skin was flawless and stained a sweet pink, and her dress was also pink. Addie's father had rescued her from a war who planned to force her into slavery, and her loyalty to him, and to Addie, was absolute. Do you feel the same way, Jean? Addie asked her handmaid, who held out a tissue as she sat on the couch next to her. All I've ever seen in my whole life is the human kingdom. I've only met a handful of other species during my very sheltered life. Going to the dragon kingdom, meeting new types of people, is incredibly exciting for me, Jean finished with a squeal of excitement. And besides, I get to be with you, my closest friend in the world. I would never want you to be alone. Addie smiled. At least her friends were going and she wouldn't be completely alone. But that didn't make the fact that she had to marry a stranger any better. I'm so glad you two are going with me. Maybe it will help make it all better. That's my girl. Stay positive in a bad situation, Claire smiled, squeezing Addie's shoulders. Now, I called the dress shop and they're sending a few dresses over in your size. In fact, she glanced at her watch, they should be here in the next 15 minutes. Addie's eyes narrowed at her mother. How long have you known about this little arrangement? Claire had the courtesy to look a little ashamed. Okay, your father told me 2 days ago. I have no idea how long he's known. Addie rolled her eyes. I hope he at least put some thought into the plans he's made for my life. Without consulting me. Claire sighed loudly and looked at the other two women in the room. I know this is terrible right now, but lots of people have arranged marriages and have found their happiness. Was yours an arranged marriage? Addie asked pointedly. She knew the answer. No. Your father and I chose each other. Exactly. I don't understand what you're going through, and I won't pretend to. Honestly, if I could stop this, I would. Addie sighed in resignation. I know, Mom. But just so you know, I don't care how this turns out. I will never forgive Father for this. She didn't share her threat to never return to Lamina, nor the threat that her child would never visit here. Claire nodded but didn't reply. Her daughter's anger would burn hot for some time, she knew that. Her independence, her freedom had been compromised when her father had taken her choice away. Eventually, though, the anger's fire would begin to die down and turn to ash. Claire just hoped it wouldn't take a lifetime, though, like her father, Addie could be incredibly stubborn when she didn't get her way. The ding of the elevator announcing guests interrupted her thoughts. The dresses are here, she exclaimed. Independent and fiery were perfect adjectives for her daughter, but a third was girly. Nothing pleased her daughter more than to try on clothes, dress up, fix her hair, and do her makeup. How exciting! Jean exclaimed as she jumped up to help the clerks who carried what looked like heavy bundles of lace, tulle, and fabric, all in white. They laid the bundles on every surface in the room. A man, the owner of the store, sashayed in, ordering his lovely minions about. When the bundles were strewn about to his satisfaction, he turned to the four women. Hello, hello, Queen Claire and Princess Adelaide. He took each of their hands in one of his and kissed the knuckles, bowing deeply. I have brought the finest dresses in my shop for you to appraise. It looks as if you brought the entire store, Addie mumbled. Poppy poked her side and gave her a look. Addie nodded and changed her tone. I have a specific style in mind, if you have it. Ah, I like a girl who knows what she wants. Pierre exclaimed with a clap of his hands. Let's get started. While you are trying on dresses, I've got some details to attend to, Claire claimed. Addie looked at her. Like what? Oh, you know, the dinner, the guests, the reception, the ceremony, the list goes on and on when you're planning a wedding, Claire answered with a wave of her hand and a small laugh. Would you like me to wait so you can help me? I don't want to make any decisions without you. The only decision I cared about has been made for me, thank you, Addie replied bitterly. But I would like my opinion taken into account, so please stay here and work. Claire nodded. Of course, sweetheart. I'll have my assistant bring my laptop up here and make the calls and reservations with your help. Thank you, Addie said. She returned her attention to Pierre. Okay, Pierre, let's see what you have to offer. Chapter 2. King Sethan, the king of dragons, watched out the window of his personal jet as it flew over the kingdom of humans. He'd always thought the place too modern for his tastes, with the skyscrapers and busy streets packed onto an island so crowded no one had room to themselves. He much preferred Wyvern, with its rolling hills and farmlands. King George appreciated his lands as well. Without them, his kingdom would have no fresh produce or meat. This alliance through marriage was as much about keeping both kingdoms safe should a war break out as it was about keeping the humans in food. As he looked down, he wondered what Princess Adelaide looked like. He was going into this marriage blind, just like she was, but unlike her, he'd made the choice to accept the alliance. He was close to her age at 35 and had never been married. The heir they would make together would bind the two kingdoms together for generations, creating a safe haven for dragon shifters and humans alike. His thoughts were interrupted by his best friend and top advisor, Conall, who plopped down in the seat next to him with a grunt. He held out a bottle of ale with a grin. Your thoughts are too heavy this fine morning, Sethan, Conall claimed in his rich brogue. The pair of men had been friends since grade school and knew each other better than anyone else. Yes, Sethan agreed heavily, his deep voice vibrating in his throat as he took the ale from his friend. He took a long drink and said, I do believe I am nervous about meeting the princess. Nervous? Conall guffawed, shaking his head at the words. I can't believe it. You, who have charmed and bedded more women than I have fingers and toes. None of those women were set to be my wife, you know, Sethan pointed out, gesturing with his bottle. They were just He searched for the right words, but all of them made him sound like an ass, so he left the sentence alone. Connell nodded sagely. Yes, this is different, I suppose. You'll actually have to live with this one after the fun is over. He chuckled at Sethan's look. Don't worry, I've heard rumors that she is full-bodied and beautiful, just the way you like your women. What she looks like hardly matters. It would be nice if she's attractive, but I have to live with her for the rest of my life. I just hope she's not flaky, or dumb or annoying. Connell chuckled again. I did my research, Sethan, before you made the agreement. You read the file. And besides, I would have told you if she was any of those things, but everything I've heard is the exact opposite. He paused to take a sip from his bottle. I have heard she's a little spoiled, but what can you expect from a princess, and an only child at that? She has a degree in foreign diplomacy with a minor in literature. She has brains. Yes, I remember all of that. I just hope she has a personality as well as brains, Sethan commented. But the alliance must take place regardless. Connell nodded. King Eckhart has already made his displeasure with this alliance clear. I see. Well, the king of the wizards will just have to be displeased. His alliance with the Wurs was a political move as much as this one is. He's hinting that it's an act that might mean you're preparing for war and need the human king's help. I'm hoping by doing this, we can prevent war, Sethan sighed. That man is such an idiot. Agreed, but at least the War Queen has brains enough to see this for what it is, the exact same thing they did a year ago. Queen Helene will hopefully keep Eckhart calm. We may be able to keep this long reign of peace. I do not want to put our people through a war. How long has it been since there was a war that involved all the kingdoms? Connell mused, his hand on his chin. He looked at Sethan. What, 150 years, at least? Closer to 200, I think, he replied, returning his attention to the window. Regardless, the alliance between Wyvern and Lomina will be solidified as soon as possible, which should hopefully prevent that idiot Eckhart from getting more happy. Sethan heard Connell reply, but did not hear his actual words. The plane had begun its descent. In less than an hour, he would meet the woman who was to become his wife. His stomach jittered a little, but he mentally rolled his eyes at himself. He was the king of Wyvern, confident in his choices as he was in his looks. He'd made the best choice for his kingdom, and he would stand by it. But his stomach still clenched when the landing gear hit the tarmac. The people of Lomina lined the streets, waving and calling out their welcome to the Dragon King and his entourage as they drove through the kingdom in 3 black SUVs sent by King George. Sethan's nerves were calmed by the constant chatter of Queen Claire, who had met them at the airport to welcome them. If Princess Adelaide was as charming as her mother, he would be very pleased with this marriage. I'm so pleased to finally meet you, Sethan, Claire was saying. I remember your parents well. When George first took the throne, they flew here to wish us well as the new royal family. Your mother was my lifesaver, she chuckled with a shake of her head. How's that? Sethan asked, truly interested in his mother's influence over this elegant woman. I was very young and inexperienced. I had grown up around the royal family, but as a councilman's daughter. I had no idea how to be a queen, she laughed. But your mother stayed in constant contact with me, answered all my questions. She even flew back for my first major event as queen. I would not have survived without her. Sethan smiled at the nostalgic look on Claire's face. Tell me about the princess. How did she take the news of our upcoming nuptials? Claire sighed. Sethan, my daughter is stubborn, quick-tempered, and outspoken. You'll know it immediately if you anger her. She raised her finger to illustrate her next point. But she's also thoughtful, loving, and loyal. If she cares for you, she will have your back no matter the circumstances. Sethan nodded, liking the fact that her mother told him both the negative and positive traits of her daughter. Thank you for your honesty. Claire sat forward and put her hand on his. Sethan, Addie is going to be hard to win. I have to tell you, she is not happy about this arrangement. She feels her freedom and choice have been robbed from her. I understand how she feels. I would have preferred to marry a woman I met and courted and fell in love with the normal way, she then sighed. But at least I had a choice in this marriage. I had the ability to say no. Claire nodded. You did have that option, but I think it would be wise to keep that to yourself. She probably knows that. She's not stupid by any means, but there is no reason to wave it in her face. She then laughed. I definitely will keep that to myself, unless she asks. Have to be truthful with the little missus. They shared a laugh as they pulled into the parking garage of the royal skyscraper. We've planned dinner for 8. That should give you time to relax. One of our courtiers will take you and your group to your rooms. Thank you, Claire. I look forward to seeing all of you this evening, she then answered as the chauffeur opened the door. When Claire disembarked, she looked around expectantly for her daughter, whose absence was noticeable and incredibly rude. She turned to Cédhan and his man, Conall. I apologize for my daughter's absence. Cédhan waved away her concern. No problem, Claire. He kissed her cheek and said goodbye, then turned to Conall as they walked away. Claire told me the princess is not happy about this marriage. Why not? She gets to be the queen of an entire kingdom, something that she isn't guaranteed here. And, if I do say so myself, you're quite the catch, Conall answered with an eyebrow wiggle. Cédhan chuckled and rolled his shoulders as a courtier walked to them. You're right. I am hot stuff. Especially when you're blowing fire, you sexy dragon, you, Conall whispered so the courtier couldn't hear. In a polished voice, the female courtier bowed and said, hello, and welcome to Lamina. Please allow me to show you and your group to your rooms. She turned and moved to the elevators. Bob will stay with your bags and have them brought in the next 10 minutes. We've secured an entire floor for you and your people, and the king and queen have assigned a portion of our staff to see to your needs. Thank you, Cédhan replied. He followed the woman into the large elevator with his group behind him. He wondered briefly about Adelaide, if her anger would be directed at him or her father. Probably both, he mused. Dinner should be interesting. Where the hell are you, Adelaide? Addie heard her mother's voice less than a second after the ding of the elevator door opening. She sighed. She had known when she'd chosen not to go downstairs to meet the Dragon King, she'd hear about it. Poppy had tried to convince her to go downstairs, but she had refused. I will not go down and meet him like some eager bride waiting for her groom to come back from the war, Addie had told her. I am not happy about this, and I will not pretend to be happy about it. Poppy had sighed and said, your mother is going to be pissed. Addie had shrugged as if she didn't care. Her mother crossed her suite swiftly, her feet moving so fast she barely touched the ground. When she found her sitting on a couch in a pair of sweatpants and a college tee, she ranted, where the hell were you? I've been here all day, Mom, Addie answered aloofly. She didn't look up at her mother but continued to peruse the magazine in her lap. Claire jerked the magazine out of her hands and threw it down on the table. How dare you be so rude to the man who is to be your husband? I raised you better than that. You are a member of the royal family. You do not get to choose to be a bitch because you're not happy. Addie stared at her mother. She'd only heard her speak like this a handful of times, and this was the first time she'd spoken to her in that manner. Mom, she began, but her mother interrupted her. I understand that you are unhappy with this situation, but it cannot be changed. Her mother heaved a deep breath and looked her daughter in her eye, pointing at her chest. You will come to dinner tonight, and you will look your best. You will be polite and charming. Mom, I'm sorry. I know it was rude, but I can't face him yet, Addie said. I understand. Claire sat next to her daughter and put a comforting hand on her knee. Your behavior tonight will be in this man's mind through your whole marriage. I know this is hard, but starting off badly is not a good idea. Addie sighed. She rolled her eyes because she knew her mother was right but didn't want to admit it. I will be on my best behavior, and I'll be polite. But don't expect miracles. The only miracle I hope to see is nothing but politeness coming out of your mouth, Claire remarked as she rose. Dinner is at 8. I expect you in the dining room by 7:45. She left without waiting for an answer. Fine. But I'm bringing Poppy, Addie yelled, although she doubted her mother heard. Céline and Conall waited on their feet for the princess to arrive for dinner. The dinner was an informal introduction, just the king, queen, princess, and the two of them. Céline had requested such a dinner. When he'd learned that the princess was not at all happy about this wedding, he decided a less public introduction might be for the best. When asked, King George had assured him that although his daughter wasn't exactly thrilled about the deal, she would not embarrass herself with her behavior. But Céline had seen the tensed squint of the man's eyes and was doubtful. George and Claire greeted him when they walked in holding hands. Céline smiled politely and participated in the idle chit-chat. As he watched the couple, he realized how much they loved each other and felt a little jealous. They'd chosen each other, he knew. His and Adelaide's would be the first arranged marriage in 100 years for either kingdom. His nerves buzzed loudly in his ears. He wondered for the millionth time if he'd made the right decision. Conall interrupted his thoughts with a cough and gestured to the door. The princess had arrived accompanied by a fairy, which caused Céline to raise an eyebrow. When he looked at her, eyes looking up and down, his breath caught momentarily and his mind went blank. Her hair, black as night, poofed out from her head in a glorious cloud of curls, complementing her ivory-colored skin perfectly. Her eyes, which stared at him blankly as she halted just inside the door, were a shocking light gray, contrasting with her hair and skin but stunning for their uniqueness. The dress she wore, a pale blue, clung to curves that called to him. He was mesmerized by her. This wasn't a mistake, he thought to himself with a smile as he moved toward his bride. As Céline walked toward her, a panther after his prey, Addie's eyes widened briefly before she managed to control her facial expressions. He wore black slacks with a white, button-up shirt with a simple, striped, gray tie. His hair was longer than she'd expected and would hang in his eyes if he let it. The color, a red like she'd never seen on a human, hypnotized her momentarily as it swayed with his movements. Eyes like emeralds watched her as he reached her. He bowed slightly, taking her hand and raising it to his lips. Princess Adelaide, he said in a deep, throaty voice that caused desire to shoot through her. King Céline, she replied breathlessly. It is a pleasure to meet you. He grinned playfully, causing her heart to twitter, just a little. Ah, a pleasure. Rumor is you are not thrilled about this wedding. Addie's smile hardened, and she responded truthfully. I do not like the idea of someone making life choices for me, no. She looked at her father, a look Céline hoped would never be aimed at him. She returned her attention to him, her face softened. But I will do my duty for this kingdom. Céline leaned in closer to whisper to her. I think you and I will enjoy each other, Adelaide. I hope you don't see it as your duty for long. When he pulled back, Addie stared at him, her face heated from the innuendo. When she saw the playful gleam in his eye, she giggled prettily. Céline, I think I agree with you. Poppy and Jean woke her early the next morning to start preparing her to get married. Her stomach hurt a little less this morning than it had all week, due in part because she'd been absolutely charmed by Céline at dinner the night before. In 2 hours' time, the pair had chatted and become friends. Addie had realized that, under different circumstances, the two of them would have grown close. She didn't know about marriage, had they been given a choice, but she liked him and he seemed to like her too. That was a start. Addie, the hairdresser and makeup artist, are here, Poppy called in her twinkling voice. She looked at Addie's breakfast, then at Jean, nodding to the plate. Addie, you need to eat. You'll feel faint at the ceremony if you don't, Jean gently warned her. Imagine if you fainted in front of the entire kingdom. The trio laughed, and Addie picked up a slice of bacon. You know, I'm not at all nervous about the wedding, or the wedding night. She paused as her face heated a little. I mean, I know what's going to happen tonight. I'm no innocent when it comes to that. I know you've never had sex before, but I promise you'll love it, especially with that sexy dragon man. Poppy exclaimed with a sly wink and a giggle. Jean's smile was mischievous as well, but she let Addie off easily by changing the subject. So if you're not nervous about those things, what are you nervous about? Addie sighed. The rest of my life. Poppy and Jean exchanged glances. Addie would have to be crazy not to be concerned. She was marrying a stranger, moving to a strange land the very next day, away from her family and all she knew. None of them had visited Wyvern. They had no idea how they would be received by the dragon shifters. Worry was in all their minds about what might happen to them after tomorrow. Jean was the first to break out of her thoughts. She clapped her hands and said, "No more negativity. We don't have time for that nonsense." She turned to the hairdresser and makeup artist, calling them over. "Come on, ladies. Make my friend even more beautiful than she already is." Addie smiled at Jean and held Poppy's hand. She was so grateful they'd be going with her. "I'm as ready as I'll ever be. Let's do this." The ceremony would take place on the rooftop. Everything had been arranged so quickly that Claire had been concerned it wouldn't look good, but her concerns were laid to rest when she saw it. Lights had been strung above the rooftop so as the evening progressed the guests would be able to see. The aisle had been created with a white carpet strewn with pink petals, Addie's favorite color. Chairs had been placed at exact intervals facing the dais, a raised portion of the roof perfect for a wedding ceremony. An arch had been created by the fairies who lived here, out of tree branches and blue daisies. The area for the reception had been set up on the floor below. Dozens of tables with white tablecloths sat separated for easy navigating. The band was setting up their instruments, only the violinists would be needed on the roof for the ceremony. Each table would have a pair of servers specifically assigned to the table, so no one had to wait for their food or drink refills. A 5-course meal had been prepared to celebrate the nuptials of King Sethan and Princess Adelaide. The guests began arriving and seating themselves. Many dragons had flown to Lamina to watch their king marry his princess. The people of both kingdoms would be able to watch the wedding on television. Crews had set up cameras earlier in the day and would be there through the reception. Very few, human or dragon shifter, felt negatively towards the marriage. Many felt it was time the two kingdoms joined. When it was time, Sethan stepped onto the dais with Conall and the king, who would be performing the ceremony, a tradition in the human kingdom. The music began to play, and Poppy slowly flew down the aisle, her eyes sparkling. She stood across from Conall and waved at him. Jean walked down next. She was not only a handmaid in Addie's eyes. Finally, Addie made her descent down the aisle. Gasps at her beauty ran through the crowd, murmurs interrupted the music but quieted quickly. Addie's smile was breathtaking. She may not have wanted to marry like this, but she felt beautiful in a way she never had. When she met Sethan's eyes, she felt even more stunning. He couldn't take his eyes off her. She preened as she walked, looking only at him. She thought to herself, "This is how I'm supposed to feel on my wedding day." She didn't care that she hadn't chosen her groom. He looked at her as if he had chosen her, and that was all that mattered. When she reached his side, he leaned over and said to her, "You look ravishing." She smiled up at him and turned to her father, who began the ceremony. Chapter 3. The reception was a blur for Addie. She ate good food, laughed when she was supposed to, held her new husband's hand, although she didn't once look at him. Her thoughts were focused on the fact that she was now a married woman. She belonged to the Dragon King, whatever that might mean. Any dreams she'd had for her future had been destroyed when she'd said "I do" before 300 witnesses. The party, as her father had referred to it at the end of the ceremony, was winding down. Addie's stomach clenched. When the reception ended, she was expected to go upstairs with her husband. She almost gagged when she thought the word, and make love with him. But it won't be making love, Addie reminded herself, because I don't love him and he doesn't love me. she had to admit, at least to herself, that she did like him. Their conversation at dinner the night before had been filled with laughter. He was intelligent, charming, and handsome. She felt like, had they met under normal circumstances, that she would have liked him. But these weren't normal circumstances. She had promised herself, and Poppy and Jean, for that matter, that she wouldn't hold her father's decision against this man. And she meant to stick by that promise. Would it be so bad if she fell in love with him? She asked herself. Her life would be better if she did. She looked at him seated next to her and watched him while he chatted with his man, Conall. They laughed together, and her thighs clenched at the sound of his deep voice raised in laughter. He was a beautiful man, and she could tell he wasn't a mean son of a bitch, like she'd said he might be when her father had told her the news. He had kind eyes and a sweet demeanor. Beneath that, though, seethed a power he could wield if the need should arise. Addie and Jean had done some digging on the internet the day after her father had broken the awful, maybe not so awful, news to her. Seethen had become king of Wyvern when his father had passed. None of the kingdoms followed the antiquated rules of the old monarchy. Seethen had been elected by the people of Wyvern to rule them. He was a more popular king than his father had been, and his marriage to Addie had been well received. However, he was very popular with the ladies. Numerous gossip sites talked about his playboy life. He was dangerously sexy and had been with so many women, according to the stories. But when he'd become king 4 years ago, he'd left that life behind him. More reputable sites discussed his policies and how he ruled Wyvern rather than his love life, and these stories were more plentiful now that he was older. Seethen took her hand and squeezed, pulling her out of her thoughts. She looked in his direction but not into his eyes and smiled. On the outside, she appeared calm and happy, but on the inside she was in turmoil. Only a few more minutes and they'd be heading upstairs. She thought she might vomit. Seethen had noticed that since the reception had begun, Addie had not once made eye contact with him. She'd barely spoken, really only speaking when someone spoke to her. Her smiles were fake, not reaching her eyes, no matter who she was smiling at. Their conversation had been limited to questions from him and short responses from her. She was unhappy, he knew, but he hoped that she'd eventually be able to find her happiness with him. He leaned over to her and whispered, "Are you ready to go upstairs? You look tired." She turned her head in his direction but looked at his ear. She nodded her head, though her face looked stricken and she seemed pale. He rose from his chair, which signaled to the assembled group to quiet. "Friends and family, it is growing late and my bride and I have had a long day. Thank you for attending. The party may not be over for you, but we are ready to go upstairs." This speech was met with whoops and catcalls from the audience, which had not been Seethen's intent. Good-naturedly, he waved as he and Addie walked through the crowd towards the elevator that would take them to their honeymoon suite, a set of rooms that had been decorated specifically for the two of them on this night. Addie kept her face down, embarrassed, because everyone knew what they were going upstairs to do. The yells from the crowd had made that perfectly clear. She hurried, practically dragging Seethen behind her, which caused more cheers. "She's in a hurry to get you upstairs. Y'all have fun. Don't break the bed. Calm down, Addie. You have him to yourself for the rest of your life." The ribald comments grew louder and louder as they hurried into the elevator. Seethen hit the button for the correct floor, then the button to close the doors more quickly. Addie was grateful for the silence that entered the elevator as the door swished closed. She leaned against the back wall with a heavy sigh. Seethen leaned back next to her as the elevator descended. He looked at her. "Are you okay?" "Yes, thank you," she responded. She pulled at her dress, obviously uncomfortable. "Is your dress uncomfortable?" "Yes." Addie was irritated by the dress. So beautiful, she'd chosen it just because it looked like every dream wedding gown she'd ever seen in her mind. However, after wearing it for 5 hours, she discovered it was the most uncomfortable thing she'd ever put on her body. She would almost rather have worn her sweats and t-shirt. You'll be able to take it off soon, C then told her. The look on her face, the fear, bothered him. I didn't mean anything by that, Addie. I'm not going to ravage you the moment we get into the suite. Addie shook her head at herself. I'm sorry, C then. I don't mean to make you feel bad. I'm just nervous. Why are you nervous? C then asked as the elevator bell dinged loudly. He stepped out and took her hand to guide her down the 3 steps that led into an incredible scene. She didn't answer his question, but he didn't notice. The suite was lit up with special lights hanging from the ceiling. C then dimmed them and grinned at her. I feel like I just walked into the noon sunlight. She laughed and nodded. Do you know if there is a way to lock the elevator? Yes, I'll do it. You probably should come look in case you need to go out, Addie told him as she moved to a panel on the wall next to the elevator. He watched as she pushed some buttons. The elevator cannot stop on this floor unless we allow it. C then nodded and they resumed their inspection of the suite. The suite's hardwood floors and ceiling had been polished to gleaming. The king-sized bed was covered with pillows of all sizes, and the bedding was a pristine white. Hanging from the ceiling, white gossamer curtains flowed over the bed with ties so they could release them and have some privacy. To the right was a small seating area with a white leather couch and love seat as well as a large black ottoman. To the left was a door which led to the bathroom, which had a bathtub the size of a small pool and a shower that could hold 5 or 6 adults comfortably. C then shook his head as they stood there admiring the beautiful room. I hate that we're only staying here for one night. This room is outstanding. We could stay longer, if you wish, Addie prompted, hoping he'd say yes. I wish we could, but we have to get to Wyvern quickly. You must be sworn in as my queen. The sooner the better, C then said. She looked so disappointed, he moved to her and put his arm around her. Don't worry, Addie, we'll come back. Addie didn't tell him about her oath never to return to Lamina. She looked sideways at him. Just so you know, I'll be expecting a real honeymoon. He started a little in surprise, but her eyes told him she was joking. He squeezed her shoulder as he threw his head back and laughed loudly. He kissed her cheek and said, Your wish is my command, my queen. Addie rolled her eyes. That sounds so weird. Queen Adelaide. It has a nice ring to it, C then said. She wrinkled her nose at him. Come on, let's get you out of that dress. She stiffened next to him. He released her and turned her to face him. Why are you nervous? You didn't answer me before. Addie looked anywhere but at C then, her embarrassment clear. Well, she paused, you see, I'm a virgin. Cethan's eyes widened and he chuckled a little. She jerked her eyes up to his, and he sobered. You're not kidding? No, she said with considerable attitude. But you're so old, he fumbled. I mean, you're so old to be a virgin. I never thought you would be. Addie rolled her eyes, so uncomfortable with the conversation. I've never met a man worth my time. I've only been on a handful of dates. I don't understand, C then said, genuinely confused by her confession. He looked her up and down. You're so beautiful, so sexy. I'm just shocked men haven't lined up for you. Don't be ridiculous. I'm the king's daughter. Most men are afraid to come anywhere near me, Addie explained. C then nodded. I can see why that would be daunting. He winked at her. Listen, let's change into robes, have a snack, and ease our way into this. If you just can't do it, we'll wait until we're home. Home? Addie stared at him. This was her home. She looked down and thought, not anymore. He was being so nice to her, patient and kind. She looked back up at him and smiled. I'd like that, C then. I requested some wine, fruit, and cheese to be in the fridge for us. Perfect. An hour later, after 3 glasses of wine, Addie felt much more relaxed. She and C then had pulled the ottoman against the couch and were stretched out on it. They'd been feeding each other pieces of fruit and cheese, giggling like teenagers as they slowly got drunk. Chapter 4. C then rose at 7 and told Addie he was going down to make sure all the arrangements had been made for their departure. He made her promise to lay in bed for at least another hour, kissed her on the lips, and left the room quietly. Addie and C then would be joining the king and queen for breakfast the next morning at 9, so they would be ready to leave by 11. Addie felt somewhat more content with this decision that had been forced on her. Her new husband had pleased her so well, she was more than a little sore that morning. She called Jean and Poppy to come to her apartment to make sure all of her things were packed and to make sure they were ready to go as well. When she told them about her soreness, Jean giggled. "If you have time, a warm bath will soothe the muscles and help the soreness," Jean told her with a mischievous grin. "How was it last night?" Addie blushed violently. "Jean, I don't kiss and tell." "You've never had anything to tell, so how do you know you don't kiss and tell?" Poppy inserted with an eyebrow wiggle. The three shared a laugh. "I'll draw a bath and you can sit for just a few minutes while you tell us a few details. Everything is packed and ready, so while you're bathing I'll get some guys up here to take your things over to the plane." "Thanks so much, Poppy," Addie murmured, her nerves lighting up again. She glanced at Jean as she followed Poppy into the bathroom. "And by the way, it was the most amazing thing I've ever done." She disappeared through the door. Jean squealed and raced after them into the bathroom with its oversized bathtub. "You cannot just say it was amazing. That's cruel." Poppy nodded her head as she turned on the water and checked the temperature. She wiggled her fingers over the water, and a lovely pink foam began to grow in the water. "This will get rid of the soreness. Now, come on, Addie. Jean and I have a little more experience than you, but we've only been with our own kind. You got to taste something new." Jean laughed at her wording. "Something new? That's funny. I have to respect my husband's privacy," she teased. She leaned toward them and whispered, "But I will tell you this. I've seen human penises before, and they've got nothing on the Dragon King." The women squealed in delight, laughing uproariously at her description. "Get into that tub," Poppy ordered, still laughing. "So did you have an orgasm?" "Yes. I've never felt anything like it in my life," Addie gushed. "They are pretty amazing, if the man you're with knows how to do it," Jean agreed. She handed Addie a washcloth as they talked. "This is the last thing I'm going to tell you, so don't ask," Addie began. Poppy interrupted by pointing a finger at her. "You mean it's the last thing you're going to tell us today?" Addie smirked. "We'll see. Anyway, you'll love this." "Well, spill it," Jean exclaimed. "I had 3 orgasms." The other 2 gasped in surprise. "I've never done that in one session." "How did he do it?" "Nope, that was the last thing I was telling you," Addie giggled. Her friends groaned in response. "Well, come on. You need to get moving before your father thinks you've gone out the window rather than speak to him." "He'll be lucky if I speak to him at breakfast," Addie mumbled, her mood plummeting. Even though she was sure she and C then would have a lovely relationship, if not true love, then at least a friendship. But that didn't mean she was going to forgive her father for stripping her of all choice. Her thoughts were still that she would never visit again after she left today. A pang of sadness at the idea that she'd never see her homeland again, but that was the choice she'd made. She slipped into the tub and felt the soreness begin to ease almost immediately. She sighed as the nearly scalding water did its job, silently thanking Jean, who had left the bathroom to direct the baggage handling. She listened to her, bossing the men around, and giggled. Again, she thanked the gods that she and Poppy were both going with her to Wyvern. She couldn't live without them. King George and Queen Claire waited downstairs in the kitchens for Cethan and Addie. Cethan had come back upstairs to get her so they could walk down together. "Are you ready?" Cethan asked after a brief kiss on the lips. Addie smiled at him and kissed him again, for just a little longer. "I'm as ready as I'm ever going to be." They walked to the elevator, hand in hand, with Poppy and Jean behind them. They rode down together, and Addie's friends explained they would be waiting in the front hall for them at 11. Poppy and Jean went in one direction to say goodbye to their other friends, while Addie and Sethan turned the other way, headed for the kitchen. Mom and Dad chose the kitchen because it's less formal, Addie commented as they walked. I'm glad they did, Sethan said. I'm not a big fan of formal dining at all, especially for breakfast. Me either, Addie replied. She pushed the door to the kitchen open, and her parents stood to greet them. Good morning, George boomed, coming forward to kiss his daughter and shake his son-in-law's hand. Addie stiffened in his embrace and did not return it. He looked into her eyes and could still see the anger residing there. She embraced her mother enthusiastically, moving away from the men, chatting happily with her as if nothing had changed. That hurt George more than if she'd called him names. Sethan had watched the exchange, had seen the look that crossed George's face when Addie had moved to her mother with so much happiness after such a sour greeting for her father. George rearranged his expression before speaking to Sethan. Good morning, Sethan, George said with a smile as he pumped his hand genially. I hope everything is well this morning. Everything is fantastic, George, Sethan answered. The plane is ready, the bags are packed, and Addie is as ready to go as she'll ever be. George glanced at his daughter. Yes. He turned back to Sethan and smiled sadly. Is she still angry with me? Sethan shrugged. We haven't talked about that. I don't know exactly what she's feeling about all this. George nodded and changed the subject. Are you hungry? Sethan returned the smile. Starved. He put the relationship of his wife and father-in-law in the back of his mind to think about later. He didn't want Addie's anger to ruin her relationship forever with her father. Hopefully, she would listen to him about that eventually and find a way to forgive her father. Breakfast was bountiful and tasty, with eggs cooked 2 different ways, 3 meats, potatoes, various fruits and juices as well as coffee and water. They ate heartily, chatting about non-essential topics. Addie had a short, whispered conversation with Claire about her evening with Sethan, leaving out specific details, but telling her enough to know that Addie had loved it. Claire prayed silently to the gods that her daughter would fall in love with this handsome man at her table. Maybe if she loves him, she'll be able to forgive her father, Claire thought hopefully as they finished their meal. George and Sethan also shared a whispered conversation about the state of the kingdoms. Rumors were flying about the Wizard King and his fury over this marriage. They made plans to keep in close contact to report anything they heard. George and Claire walked them to the front foyer and out the door to the waiting SUVs that would take them to the airport where Sethan's plane waited to return them to Wyvern. Addie's stomach clenched when she hugged her mother. She would never be back here again, she would only see her mother if she visited Wyvern. Her lip quivered just a little as she pulled away from her mother. Claire smoothed her daughter's hair and gave her a watery smile. Baby girl, I'm so excited for you. I think you'll love Wyvern. I hope so, Mom. Addie's voice hitched a little on the word Mom, but she swallowed the tears and said, Bye, Mom. I love you. Bye, baby. Call me tonight and tell me what it's like, Claire told her, pulling her in for one more hug. George stepped forward as Claire said goodbye to Sethan, Jean, and Poppy, reminding Addie's 2 friends to take care of her, watch over her. Jean and Poppy hugged their queen, promising to take care of Addie as much as she would let them. They laughed. Claire turned and watched the exchange between her husband and her daughter, the 2 most important people in her life. Goodbye, sweetheart, George said, his hands taking Addie's hands and kissing each of them. I will miss you. Addie's demeanor had changed when her father had stepped forward. Stiffly, she allowed him to kiss her hands, then withdrew them from his hold. Goodbye, father. She turned and walked to the last vehicle in which she and Sethan would ride together. Poppy and Jean would be in the car in front of them. George watched his daughter walk away, a sad expression clouding his face. Claire took his hand and squeezed it as they waved goodbye. Don't worry, dear. She'll come around. She's just angry right now. George sighed. I hope so. I can't stand the thought that she hates me. Claire laughed. Honey, she's just like you. She'll be angry with you for a while, then she'll forgive, because it's too hard to stay mad. George nodded as the SUVs disappeared on their way to the airport. Addie leaned her chin on her hand and watched as her home quickly disappeared as they drove away. A heavy sigh escaped her lips, she'd never be here again. A tear slipped out of her eye before she could blink it away. Sethan touched her cheek with his finger, lifting the tear off. I'm sorry you're sad, Addie. Addie smiled at him as another tear trailed down her face. She cleared her throat before speaking. I'll be fine. I've never been outside of Lamina. And the only time I didn't live with my parents was when I was at college. I know this is probably the hardest thing you've ever done, but I promise I will do my best to make it easier as the days go on. He took her hand and kissed the knuckles gently. She smiled at him, tears gone, and turned his hand over to kiss his palm. I never stay sad long. And I am excited too. I can't wait to see what your home looks like. I've heard it's very different from mine. So different you might think you've left the planet, Sethan laughed. He held her hand loosely throughout the trip as he described his home. When they turned onto the tarmac where his plane waited, he said, What I've been told, you can't get you ready for it. You'll just have to see it for yourself. Sethan led her, Poppy, and Jean to the plane, leaving Conall to deal with the luggage, of which there was a ton. The women had packed everything they owned. Conall called to Sethan, We may have to land halfway there, to refuel, because of the weight. Be quiet, you, Jean called to him teasingly. Ladies must have all their essentials. Essentials? Conall called back. You mean you packed toilets? Sethan rolled his eyes. Come on, ladies. Let me show you the plane. Walking onto the plane was like stepping into a luxurious condo. The plane boasted 4 leather recliners attached to the floor with seatbelts for security around a small table. There was also a long couch for napping as well as a private room at the rear with a bed. A bathroom, larger than most airplane bathrooms, was situated at the front just behind the cockpit. 2 flight attendants waited patiently for the passengers to find their seats. Sethan and Addie sat in the recliners next to each other. Jean took the one across from Addie, but Poppy chose to flit about the cabin investigating everything. After takeoff, Sethan said, I've never spent time around a ferry. We have them in Wyvern, but they stay in the forests. He was watching Poppy open every cabinet to peek inside. Really? Addie asked, interested. Honestly, there aren't many ferries at all in Lamina. The ones who do live there live like members of families. They hang out together some, but mostly they stay with their families. That's a big difference between our kingdoms, Sethan told her. Fairies don't seem to like us much in Wyvern, although they do have seats in our Senate. Fairies aren't properly represented in Lamina, Poppy piped up, but with a wave of her hand dismissed the notion. None of us there really care about politics. Fairies have a bigger role in our society, even though they don't socialize with us, Sethan commented. Very interesting, Addie said. Conall walked swiftly onto the plane, a look of slight panic on his face. Sethan, we have a small problem that could develop into a huge one. He switched on the television and tuned it to the news station that covered the entire world, not just one kingdom. A newscaster, a human, was speaking rapidly. King Eckhart released a statement this morning, denouncing the marriage of King Sethan, the Dragon King, and the human princess, Adelaide. He claims this marriage is a direct violation of an agreement he and King Sethan had regarding Sethan's marriage to Eckhart's daughter, Saran. Addie gasped and looked at Sethan, whose jaw was clenched so tightly she was afraid it might crack his teeth. He was glaring at the television as if he wished he could reach in and wring the poor reporter's neck. King Eckhart refused to answer any calls regarding this matter. However, he claims that because King Sethan broke this agreement, it could be seen as a threat to Hex, the wizard kingdom. Sethan slammed his hand down on the armrest. This is absolutely absurd. His daughter is 12. 12. I couldn't marry her. Did you make the agreement? Addie's voice was quiet, which, to Poppy and Jean, meant bad news. Then did not yet know that. Hell no. He looked at her, furious. I am not a double dealer, Addie. I pledged to marry you 6 weeks ago. I stand by my promises. Addie's eyes widened. You've known about this marriage for 6 weeks. Then realized his mistake, but it was too late. He nodded. So my father has known for 6 weeks? Again he nodded. Addie clenched her jaw so that her thoughts didn't escape. She turned away from the group to look out the window, silenced. Then felt badly about his wife's anger and hurt, but he had more pressing matters to deal with. Like preventing a war. He turned to Connell. Remember what I told you about Eckhart? How he approached me with this, and I told him no. Connell nodded. He wanted to create the alliance so that the 3 kingdoms, ours, his, and the Wurs, could attack the humans. Addie's attention was recaptured by his words. What for? He wants to destroy the humans and divide Lamina into 3 territories to be handed to the other 3, then answered quickly. I need to contact George immediately. Then rose and went to the bedroom for privacy to make the call. Poppy had settled into a seat during the newscast, and she and Jean were looking at Addie with concern. Addie, are you okay? Poppy asked. A little worried about the idea of war, because I got married, Addie retorted. We meant are you okay about your dad, Jean clarified. Addie's nostrils flared. I cannot believe he knew about this for over a month and didn't tell me. To be honest, Addie, I wouldn't have told you either, Poppy told her. Why not? Addie asked heatedly, her eyes flashing at her friend. Jean touched her hand. Calm down, Addie. I agree with Poppy. Addie opened her mouth, but Jean overrode her comment. If I were your father, I wouldn't have told you. I would have been afraid you'd run or find a way out of it somehow. She wagged her finger playfully at Addie. You know it's true. Addie stared at her, ridiculous rebuttals running through her head. Eventually, she cursed under her breath. Damn it, I hate to admit you're right. I would have run away or married some random I could divorce quickly. Addie, that's just shameful, Poppy admonished with a smile to ease the sting. I guess, Addie said. And I probably don't mean it. What happens if the wizards attack the humans? Jean asked. Do we have a defense against that kind of attack? Somewhat, Addie answered quietly. You know the ogres made their home in the human kingdom because the wizards and witches treated them like slaves. They've created weapons of some sort to help humans defend against magical attacks. But none of the other kingdoms know that. Not even the dragons? Poppy asked. I don't think so. I mean, because of this alliance, my father might have told Sethan about the ogres. Addie shrugged. I have no idea. Sethan walked back into the main cabin, a serious look on his face. He sat next to Addie and said, I spoke with your father. He received news this morning from one of his sources. He's been preparing for some time. The captain's voice came over the intercom. We'll be landing in about 10 minutes. Please take your seats. Sethan leaned around Addie and pointed out the window. You'll be able to see the castle in just a second. Addie and Jean put their faces to the window, eager to see their new home. Poppy jumped out of her seat and whisked to a window behind them. Triple gasps sounded when the castle came into view. Sethan smiled to himself. His castle was breathtaking, like something out of a fairy tale. People never forget the first time they saw it. He leaned over to Addie and said, Welcome home. Addie glanced at him and smiled, but he could see the sadness behind it. This wasn't her home yet, he knew, but he would help her make it feel like her home as soon as he could. Addie returned her attention to the window. The only thing dull about the castle was the gray stone it had been fashioned from, but even that couldn't steal from the magnificent picture created by the castle and the landscape around and behind it. The castle was surrounded by a moat filled with green water and a huge gate leading into the main entrance. C then told them, "The moat is filled with creatures I don't want to describe to you. Don't go to the moat." They nodded and he continued. "The gate is only closed during attack, so it actually hasn't been closed for 100 years. The castle boasted 3 towers that stood taller than any other part of the castle." C then told her his rooms were in the western tower at the very top. The parapet stretched along the tops of 2 side walls, and the courtyard looked as big as 2 football fields. If Addie squinted her eyes, she could see little dots moving about as they descended. They flew over the top of the castle and lost sight of it. Her nerves began to sing again. She sat back in her seat and began chewing on her nails, a habit she'd had since she'd been in elementary school. Her mother had always chided her for it, pulling her hand away from her face. Jean now took over the role. She took Addie's hand away from her mouth and squeezed it reassuringly. C then saw the gesture and took her other hand in his, patting it gently. Addie scrunched her nose up. She pulled both her hands away from them and began twisting them together. Questions filled her mind. What if she hated it here? What if no one in the castle liked her? What if they were so different from her that she would never be able to adjust? Her hand went back to her mouth and she chewed her thumbnail. When Jean reached for her hand, she gave her a look that said, "Don't touch me." Jean lifted her hands in defeat and sat back in her chair, a small smile on her face. Addie looked out the window again as she felt the plane lowering and heard the landing gear pop out of the bottom of the plane. Her right thumbnail was now gone, so she switched to her left. She stared out the window, her stomach clenching and her heart beating so hard she thought it might commit suicide. Chapter 5. When the plane landed, Addie rose slowly from her seat, her stomach so jumpy she worried it might look like something was trying to escape from under her shirt. She put her hand over her belly in an attempt to calm herself. Everyone else was to get off before them, and she and C then would exit together last. Quite a crowd of Wyvern citizens, dragon shifters as well as some of the fairies, had gathered on the tarmac to get a glimpse of their new queen. C then took her hands after everyone else had disembarked. He may not know her well, but he could see the nerves hopping in her eyes, feel the tension in her body when he touched her. He massaged her hands with his thumbs as he held them and looked into her eyes, ducking his head a little when she didn't meet them. She looked up at him, and her worry was clear on her face. "Addie, please don't be worried. My people are good people, they were excited about this marriage." "Why do you think they've gathered here?" he asked, his eyebrows lifted. When she didn't answer, he grinned. "To see you, beautiful lady. Do I look all right? Are my clothes wrinkled from the trip?" She'd chosen black slacks, a white, sleeveless button-up blouse, and a hot pink jacket. Her shoes perfectly matched the jacket, and Poppy had done her hair only a few moments before the plane landed. She looked like a proper, modern queen, classy, stylish, and elegant. "Except for when you were wearing nothing but a smile, I've never seen you look more beautiful," C then said with a little growl in the back of his throat, eliciting a laugh from her. "You perv," she teased, smiling at him. She'd needed the joke to ease her mind. She rolled her head on her neck, straightened her shoulders, and shook out her arms. "Okay, I'm ready." C then laughed. "You aren't going into the boxing ring." Addie lifted a finger. "Ah, but charming the masses is much the same. I think I'd prefer the boxing ring." With a deep breath, she said, "Let's do this." "My lady," he replied, bowing her to the door so that she could exit first. Addie breathed in again and stepped through the door of the plane. A tumultuous noise greeted her. The crowd had burst into cheers when she'd appeared. She watched as the crowd yelled and waved at her, frozen for a moment in shock. They really seemed happy to see her, as if she were some celebrity or something. C then stepped onto the stairs behind her, and the volume increased to a deafening roar. He was a popular king who ruled fairly and diplomatically. His people adored him because he took care of them, making decisions on the behalf of the poorest person as well as the richest. He lifted his arm and waved to the crowd, a proud smile on his face. He took her hand and raised theirs together in a show of solidarity, and the crowd went wild, growing even more boisterous and loud, if that were possible. "Wave to them, my queen. They love you already," she then said into her ear over the crowd's noise. Addie lifted her other hand as they walked down the steps to the tarmac, waving to the people who cheered for her as if she were a hero. She plastered a smile on her face, hoping it didn't look as manic as it felt. Poppy and Jean would see it, but they knew her better than anyone else. "Do we go over to them?" Addie asked. She'd never seen anything like this. When her father and mother returned from a trip, the paparazzi were there and sometimes a dozen or so people who were there just to see them, but that was it. They never had a crowd waiting for them. "Not today," she then answered. "Just keep waving. You're about to see something special." She looked at him, but his face remained deviously expressionless. She narrowed her eyes. "What are you about to do?" "You'll see," he said. "Connell will tell you what to do." He moved away from her, and she felt instantly lost. Connell stepped up beside her. "My lady," he began. "Call me Addie," she told him for the 50th time. "I'm technically not supposed to call the queen by her first name," he told her for the 50th time. "I'm not your queen yet," she answered. She then had walked alone to a place about 20 feet from the crowd, who had hushed on his approach. "What's going on?" "Just watch," Connell said, a grin on his face. Poppy and Jean had joined them, excitement all over their faces. Addie asked, "Do you two know what's going on?" They nodded but didn't speak. Poppy put her hand on Addie's face and turned her head so that she once again faced her husband. "Ladies and gentlemen." She then called over the crowd, who were now completely silent so they could hear their beloved king speak. "Thank you all so much for joining me in welcoming my bride." He gestured to Addie, who lifted a hand in acknowledgement. The crowd screamed in welcome. "Do I walk over there?" she asked quickly. "No. Just wait," Connell said. "Wait for what?" But he didn't answer, so she returned her attention to her husband. She then grinned at her and wiggled his eyes. Addie tilted her head, a slow smile creeping on her face. Whatever he was about to do, her anticipation and excitement had grown while standing there. "He knows how to work a crowd," she mused. "He's as much entertainer as he is politician. I've only been gone a few days, but I've missed Wyvern. I am so happy to be home, and my wife and I are eager to make this her home as well." She then waited while the crowd finished their cheers. "And I've missed this most of all." Before their eyes, she then shifted into his dragon form, his clothes and shoes in tatters around him. Addie, Poppy, and Jean gasped while the spectators screamed for their dragon king. Addie had seen dragon shifters on television, but never in person. The sight was awe-inspiring. Her mouth had dropped open in surprise and wonder, and she had no words for the beauty she saw before her. She then spread his wings in a show of power, roaring so loudly that Poppy, in fright, covered her ears. He was spectacular. The wings were a shade of green Addie had never seen before, while the scales on his body were such a deep purple as to almost be black. The arms were muscular and frightening, ending in massive hands with claws as long as her foot. He stood as high as a 2-story house, maybe more, and his feet were as long as a dining room table. Spikes of different lengths grew on the head, a defense mechanism, possibly. The face looked menacing when it turned to her, teeth showing, as if at any moment he might attack a bystander simply because he could. But Addie looked into the dragon's eyes, and she could see Sethan in them. The kind, humor-filled eyes stared at her from the dragon's face, and her hands longed to touch him. Sethan's dragon paws beckoned to her. With hesitation, she moved towards her husband, but Connell took her hand to stop her. She looked at him, confused. "He wants me to come over there," she told him, trying to pull her hand away. "You have to ride him," Connell explained. Shock ripped through her. Ride him? What? Her voice had risen in pitch. As a show of power, the dragon kind always shifts into his dragon form and flies to the castle. He never rides in a car, Conall explained. The crowd will shift as well and follow at a distance, roaring over the countryside. It's kind of like a parade. Why do I have to ride him? Addie was appalled at the idea. She looked at Cthan, who waited patiently for her. There was nothing to hold on to, and she had a slight fear of heights. You're to be his queen. You can't fly yourself to the castle, and if you ride in a car, it shows a lack of respect for your husband as well as a lack of solidarity with him. Conall began to lead her to her husband. What about Poppy and Jean? She looked at her friends, who were as wide-eyed as she was. I will escort them to the castle, Conall replied proudly. You mean they'll ride on you? If they like. Or we can ride in a vehicle, Conall explained. But I hope they want to fly. Addie laughed a little as she reached her husband's side. He bent his massive neck and nuzzled her gently with his snout. She reached up and ran one hand along his snout, and he let out a sigh of contentment. She smiled at him but gave him a warning. We're going to talk about this little surprise when you are human again. Cthan made the dragon equivalent of a snicker. He nudged her again, a little harder, and the crowd laughed happily. She looked back at Conall. How do I climb on? Cthan's dragon hands wrapped around her waist and lifted her to his shoulder, where he plopped her down like a parrot on a pirate. She held fast to one of the spikes on his head. Cthan laid down so that his back was flat. Crawl to his back and find the area just above where his wings grow on his back. That's the most comfortable spot for a human rider, Conall called to her. Wide-eyed, Addie crawled across his back as gracefully as she could, gripping his scales so tightly she feared she might hurt him. When she'd found the spot, Cthan lifted to a standing position and waited for her to settle. She made a thumbs-up gesture at Conall, who signaled Cthan. The wind from his wings battered the tarmac, blowing everyone's hair in all directions. Addie felt the muscles under her but bunch and release as they lifted into the air smoothly. The wings caused loud flapping sounds as Cthan continued his ascent, but once they reached the height he desired, they began to soar. Addie clung to his back for dear life, and a few times, when he would dip unexpectedly, she would let out a little screech. He bellowed his dragon roar, a freight train 5 feet from her ears, and she heard answering bellows from behind. She turned only her head, never releasing her grip on the spikes. Dozens of dragons, in a myriad of colors, followed their king in a formation much like geese on the way south for the winter. They dipped and dove and danced in the air, unlike Cthan, who flew steadily straight out of respect for his passenger. A dragon, gray and green, flew next to them with 2 passengers clinging to his back. Addie guessed Conall had talked Poppy and Jean into riding. She cautiously lifted a hand to briefly wave, then put it right back where it had been. Jean didn't move her hands at all, but Poppy waved enthusiastically from the back of the dragon. She is positively fearless, Addie thought with a smile. A sudden dip in the flight pattern jerked Addie's attention to the front again. Nothing. She looked down and watched as the land moved quickly underneath them. She was too high to see many details, but the land was so much more country than her kingdom, where the streets were all paved and everyone lived, worked, and played in skyscrapers. Here, the land was dotted with farmland and small cottages. She'd read that Wyvern was a much more rural land, in fact, the most rural land in the world, but she'd never been there to see it for herself. Wyvern was so different from Lamina already, and she felt the stirring of homesickness in the pit of her belly along with the nerves that had yet to dissipate. The castle had been in view since they'd taken flight, although Cthan had not followed a direct path to it, he'd flown in wide arcs, and she would have to ask him why later. As the castle loomed closer, obviously the biggest building in the kingdom, Addie tensed up. She would be meeting her in-laws in just a few minutes. I hope my hair isn't a total disaster after this flight of dragons, she grumbled to herself. Cthan began his descent, adjusting slowly so that Addie had time to adjust her seat. He roared on their approach. Several other dragons roared but began to separate from the formation they'd created. Only one remained to follow them into the courtyard of the castle, Connell with Poppy and Jean on his back. Sethan's feet touched the ground gently, barely jolting Addie. Poppy and Jean were not so lucky. A cloud of dust kicked up under Connell's feet and both women screeched. The courtyard was massively huge, stretching for more than 100 yards in each direction. The castle also looked a lot bigger now that they were so close to it. People had been wandering about when they'd begun their descent, but just like at the airport, they gathered to welcome back their king. At one end of the courtyard, Addie had seen as they descended, was a lovely garden filled with flowers, bushes, and trees. She couldn't wait for a walk there. The door to the castle was massive and wooden, open to let fresh air in on the lovely day. Standing in the doorway were 3 people, dressed just a little nicer than the people in the courtyard, as if this were a special day for them. Addie realized these people must be Sethan's family. Her stress level jumped. She looked around, hoping someone would come over to help her get off Sethan's back. Sethan again knelt close to the ground to help Addie get off more easily, and a man stepped forward to help her. He raised his hand to her and she slid off without making a fool of herself, as she'd been fearing. Jean and Poppy had also been assisted in getting off Connell and were walking towards her. She moved to them, patting her hair and adjusting her clothes. "Do I look okay?" "My hair must be a disaster," she said as they reached her. Jean's hair was a mess, so she assumed hers must be too. Poppy looked as beautiful as ever. "Don't worry, I can fix your hair in a jiffy," Poppy said. She flew up around Addie's head and ran her hands over her hair. A little puff of air escaped her palms, and Addie's hair was stylishly coiffed once again. "Jean, your turn." While she fixed Jean's, Addie said, "Thanks, Poppy. I don't want to look bad when I meet Sethan's parents." "You'll be enchanting, as always," Sethan said from behind her. Addie and her friends turned simultaneously and gasped when they saw Sethan and Connell, who was standing next to him. "Why are you naked?" Addie gasped, her hand over her mouth. Jean was looking in any direction but the 2 men, while Poppy stared blatantly at them. Sethan and Connell laughed together. "I'm sorry, Addie," Sethan apologized with a smirk. "I should have warned you about that. You didn't see my clothes shred and fly off?" Addie thought about the scene at the airport. She had noticed his clothes flying off, but hadn't really thought about what it would mean. She'd been awed by the sight of her husband as a dragon and nervous about the fact that she would have to ride him, and not in a sexual way. The fact that his clothes had disappeared had been the last thing on her mind. She cleared her throat and looked away nervously. "I guess I didn't think about it. And now you're standing here naked for everyone to see." Sethan chuckled again as he shrugged into a robe held aloft by a servant. Connell was also helped into a robe. Sethan wrapped his arm around his wife's waist and smiled a sexy smile at her. "What's wrong, babe? Jealous?" Addie smiled back warily. Yeah, I guess. I mean, I bragged about your girth to my friends, but that doesn't mean I want them to see it firsthand." Sethan roared with laughter at her answer. "I made an assumption. We're so used to being nude in front of each other in this kingdom that I forget humans don't do that." No, we don't," Addie replied as he took her hand and pulled her along to meet his parents. "My apologies again, sweetheart. But I do have to tell you, you and Jean will have to adjust to the nakedness." Addie laughed at his tone, which was semi-serious, semi-joking. "Does this mean I can walk around naked too? Whenever I feel like?" Sethan's eyes narrowed. "Of course you can. In our rooms." She nudged him playfully as she looked back to make sure Jean and Poppy were right behind her. They stepped up to the door of the castle. A man and a woman, obviously Sethan's parents, stepped forward to greet her and her friends. A third person, a woman older than Sethan, stood in the doorway with a smile on her face. Addie assumed this was his sister. She looked so much like Sethan it was hard not to. Welcome, Princess Adelaide, the woman gushed, her hands out to take both of Addie's. I'm Veda, Sethan's mother, and this is Malik, his father. Welcome to Wyvern, Malik said, bending at the waist to kiss her knuckles. Please call me Addie, she said with a smile. She gestured to her friends. These are my closest friends, Jean and Poppy. And our daughter, Romy, Veda said. The lovely, raven-haired woman stepped forward and shook hands all around. It's a pleasure to meet all of you. Come inside, Veda encouraged. She took Addie's hand and headed inside. Addie looked at Sethan, who winked at her and followed closely, chatting with his father. I remembered how your mother reacted the first time one of us shifted back into human form. Veda laughed and shook her head. That's why I had robes waiting for Sethan and Conal. Addie laughed. Thank you. I'm sure I'll adjust to it, but it was a bit shocking for Jean and me. Not so much for your fairy friend, Veda teased, causing Addie to laugh. She doesn't embarrass easily, that's for sure, Addie claimed. Poppy slipped between them. Who doesn't like a little show every now and then? Veda laughed. I think we're all going to get along very well. She led them into the dining room, where a lovely early dinner was set up. We thought you might be hungry after your travels. I know Sethan and Conal will be. Shifting burns a lot of calories, you know. Addie did know that, but only because she'd read it years ago. She had a lot to learn about dragon shifters. Questions popped into her mind as she walked to the table and took the seat next to Sethan. He took her hand. Are you okay? He asked, concern in his eyes. I'm good, but I have a ton of questions. I would kill for a notebook and pen to carry around so I can write them down. Sethan smiled at her organized mind. I'll see what I can do. He kissed her cheek and turned to answer a question posed by his sister. After a lengthy dinner where Addie was introduced to people continuously, with not a single name remaining in her head for more than a few seconds, Sethan leaned close to her and asked if she was ready to go upstairs. Yes, please, she murmured. Can we show Poppy and Jean where they'll be staying so I know? Of course. He rose, took her hand as she followed him, and turned to address his parents. Mom, Dad, Addie and I are tired, as I'm sure Poppy and Jean are. He looked at the two, who nodded, Poppy covering her mouth as a yawn escaped her. Good night, Veda said as she rose. I didn't realize how much time had passed. She looked at Addie and smiled. Tomorrow, you and I will spend some time together. I want in on that, Romy called. I'd really like to introduce you to my husband and daughter. My daughter wasn't feeling well this evening, so she and Kirk stayed upstairs. I'm sorry to hear that, Addie said. I look forward to getting to know you both better. Everyone said their good nights and Sethan led the trio of women to the elevator. Jean and Poppy, the two of you have rooms connected to each other on the second floor of the same tower as our rooms. My mother wanted the three of you to be close. That is so kind of her, Jean commented. She seems like such a nice person, Poppy said. Sethan smiled. You'll love her as you get to know her, I promise. I already do, Addie told him, gripping his arm. Your father and sister seem pretty great too. I'm very lucky to have my family, Sethan said, smiling. Here we are, ladies. He opened a door that led into the suite of rooms Jean and Poppy would be sharing. Your bags have already been brought up. Jean stopped at the door. You don't have to show us around. We can manage. Go to bed. Jean winked and Poppy giggled. Addie rolled her eyes. Good night, friends. Good night, they said together as they shut the door behind them. Chapter 6. Sethan led Addie to their suite of rooms, explaining, the rooms are pretty masculine. Anything you want to change, we can. Addie nodded and asked, how many rooms are there? He produced a key from his pocket. We have a living room and a bedroom, both sizable enough to cut in half with a wall and make more rooms. A bathroom the size of a small house with a bathtub the size of a small pool. Nice, Addie complimented. I can't wait to use the bathtub. She leaned against him as he pushed the door open. One of my guilty pleasures. Nothing guilty about that, Sethan said as they stepped inside. His description of its size had been accurate. The living room was massive and boasted large, incredibly masculine leather furniture. The couch, love seat, and two oversized chairs looked like if she sat in them she'd sink and need help getting out. Someone, Addie guessed his mother or perhaps a decorator, had added accent pillows of various colors to liven up the dark chocolate of the furniture. An ottoman sat in the center on a beautiful throw rug in front of a fireplace Addie was sure she could stand in, should she choose to do so. Above the fireplace was a panel that almost certainly hid a television from sight. To the left was a desk, dark wood and covered in the accoutrement of an office. The large chair would easily fit Sethan's large frame, and she could picture him working there at night. A bay window with a window seat was directly behind the desk and would offer a stunning view of the kingdom during the day. A mini fridge and microwave were probably hidden in the cabinets near the desk. That's what her father had done in the office in her parents' suite. It suits you, Addie said, looking at her husband. I hope that's a compliment, Sethan teased her. She giggled. It is. I want to see the rest. Of course, Sethan responded, taking her hand. If you want to change anything, you can. My mother plans to renovate a suite on this floor that will be ours. The two of you will probably start on it right away. We won't be sharing rooms? Addie was surprised by this. It was an antiquated practice for the upper-class husband and wife to have separate rooms. Her parents had always stayed in the same rooms. They each had offices that were strictly theirs, but they'd slept in the same room and had guests in the shared suite. Yes, we'll be sharing rooms, he replied, a little surprised by her question. I just thought you'd like a place to work that is just yours. Addie sighed in relief. Are they close enough that we could combine the rooms and create a large living space rather than two separate spaces? Sethan smiled. I like that idea. We can talk to a contractor tomorrow. He opened a door to the right of the fireplace and gestured her inside. This is our bedroom. The bedroom was also rather masculine, but Addie didn't mind. The furniture was dark wood polished to gleaming, and the spacious room was dominated by the bed. A hulking mass, it was larger than any bed she'd ever seen. The bed needed steps to get up on it because the mattresses were so thick and the base was so high, at least 3 feet. The bed, mahogany if Addie was any judge, had 4 thick columns at the corners with a headboard as tall as Sethan covered with leather stretched tautly. Mounds of pillows were heaped at the headboard, and the comforter was thick and the color of tree leaves. Addie lifted it, the sheets were perfectly matched and softer than a baby's skin. Wow, Addie breathed, causing Sethan to grin. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and whispered in her ear, I'd like to christen this bed with you. No other woman has slept on it. Sethan woke early, as usual. Addie woke with him so they could eat breakfast together. He'd ordered breakfast to be brought to them in their rooms, as he now called them after only a day of having her there. In his mind, she belonged there. He watched her dig into the blueberry pancakes that had been made specifically for her. He had asked Poppy and Jean about her favorite foods as well as what she wouldn't eat. Giving her what she liked was the least he could do. She'd given up her home when she had agreed to marry him. So what are you doing today? Addie asked as she wiped her mouth delicately after her third bite of pancakes. Are your pancakes good? Sethan asked. She cocked her head at the change of subject. They're amazing. Now answer my question. I have some kingly business to attend to, which you're more than welcome to sit in on. You'll die of boredom, though. Connell often pinches my leg under the table to keep me awake. Addie laughed. I'm good here, I think. But what exactly am I supposed to do? I have no idea how to be a queen. I mean, do I have a job or am I just a castle wife, haha? Sethan shook his head. Honestly, I have no idea what a queen does. That's where my mother comes in. She can be pushy, but she'll help you like she helped your mother. Addie sighed, looking away. I probably should have talked to my mother more about this. C then reached over and took her hand. For the next week, you'll be busy preparing for your coronation ceremony. Addie choked a little on the bite of pancake she'd put in her mouth as he spoke. After swallowing some juice, she looked at him, her hand on her chest. My what? You will have a coronation ceremony, which establishes you as the Queen of Wyvern rather than just my wife. Is there a difference? Here there is. I can take a wife as the king but not make her Queen of Wyvern, C then explained, gesturing with a forkful of pancake. Because you will be queen, if something were to happen to me, you will remain the queen and will rule in my place. Addie was thankful she hadn't taken a bite. She watched silently as he stuffed the fork and pancake in his mouth, hers hanging open in shock. He didn't notice until he swallowed and reached for his juice. Are you okay, baby? He asked. Can you explain what you mean by I will rule in your stead? Her voice shook a little. Sethan's brow creased. Your father didn't explain to you what it meant to be queen in Wyvern. Addie's fork clattered to her plate, her appetite lost. No. He didn't explain anything except I had no choice but to marry you and move here. Sethan took her hands in his and squeezed. Don't worry, babe. First of all, nothing is going to happen to me. Secondly, if that were to happen, you would have lots and lots of help. None of that is really the point, Sethan. My father didn't bother to tell me information that I needed. Would you have run away had you known? Rather than marry me? Addie looked at him, indecision clear in her eyes. She sighed. Now that I know you, I'm not so mad about the marriage thing, even if I didn't choose it. But honestly, if I had known that little caveat, I might have hidden with the ogres until you'd married someone else. Sethan laughed. You are way too beautiful to live with the ogres. Addie chuckled a little too. Agreed. But desperate times call for desperate measures. Sethan cleared his throat before releasing his next words. As soon as the date is set, you need to invite your parents. They must be there to show their approval. The King of Hex and Queen of Lupguru will also be attending. Addie stared out the window, pondering all the information, her cold breakfast forgotten. I'll call my mother and let her know tonight. Your mother and I will surely set a date today. Yes, ma'am, Sethan replied as he rose and kissed her forehead. What time would you like to meet with my mother and her entourage to plan your coronation? Lunch okay? Of course. It's your first day here, and I hate that we have to start planning this so quickly, Sethan commented as he walked to the door. I understand, Addie called. Poppy and Jean were at the door when Sethan opened it. Come on in, ladies. Addie's at the table. He glanced back at Addie. See you later, babe. Bye, she called after him, then rolled her eyes at the giddy looks on her friends' faces. What? You two are such cute little lovebirds, Jean quipped, plopping down in the seat left vacant by Sethan. Addie rolled her eyes as Poppy said, I think some love will spring there, and quickly, if I can read dragon shifters as well as I can humans. We'll see, Addie murmured. She filled them in on what Sethan had explained to her moments ago. So what that means is, once the coronation is complete, I'm the queen whether he's with me or not. Holy crap, Poppy breathed out. Jean's eyes were wide. Even if he dies? Yep. Wow. A moment of silence filled the room as the three women thought about the implications. Jean brightened. Subject change, she announced. What? Addie asked, her voice morose. So all the dragons lose their clothes when they shift, correct? Jean paused to watch them nod. So, I saw not only your husband's well-endowed form, I saw Conal's. She wiggled her eyebrows. Addie and Poppy held with laughter, and Addie playfully slapped her thigh. Don't look at my husband. Jean gigged, her hand over her mouth. I only briefly looked. I was much more interested in Conal. And let me tell you. She held her hands apart several inches. And that's not even erect. The trio screamed with laughter. Poppy leaned over and said to Addie, she has been talking non-stop about that man's penis. It's becoming an obsession. A little obsession isn't unhealthy, Addie reasoned, a sly smile on her face. I'll do a little digging, see what he thinks about you. Yes, please. Jean said. She glanced down at Addie's breakfast. What's with the uneaten pancakes? Those are your favorite. Addie said, I freaked about the whole queen, no matter what thing. Couldn't finish. Understandable, Poppy said. I'm having lunch with the queen and her entourage to plan my coronation, Addie told them, rising to get ready. You two need to come with me, so go get dressed. Her friends had come up in comfortable clothes. I need your support. We'll be back soon, Jean told her before kissing her cheek and hurrying out. What time? By 11:30, Addie called as she padded into the bathroom. Gotcha. Poppy said as they closed the door. 2 weeks later, the coronation ceremony date had been set and invitations sent. In another week, Addie would be the official queen of Wyvern, whether she wanted to be or not. Her relationship with Seethan was continuing to grow stronger, and the beginnings of love had stirred in her heart. But she kept it to herself. She was afraid he didn't feel the same and didn't want to humiliate herself by sharing. Their sex life, however, was so hot she was sore almost every day because they had sex almost every single night. She would soak in the tub the next morning before attending any meetings that required her presence. She felt more tired than normal, but she assumed it was because she was up so late enjoying the attentions of an insatiable man. And she was becoming equally insatiable as well. One afternoon, Jean asked Addie for a tampon. She didn't have time to go back downstairs before they went to meet with Veda, as the queen had insisted over and over. Addie called her until she had acquiesced. Addie told her where they were, then mumbled to herself. She pulled out her calendar and calculated. What are you mumbling about? Poppy asked her. I should have started my period 3 days ago, Addie said quietly with very little emotion. 3 days? Poppy asked, her eyes widening. 3 days for what? Jean asked as she walked back into the room, drying her hands on a towel. Poppy explained, and Jean stared at Addie. But you've always been so regular. Are you sure? I'm positive, Addie replied. She picked up the phone and dialed Veda. It's all right, dear, Veda soothed. We have a doctor who lives here at the castle for random emergencies. I've already sent for him but didn't tell him why. Addie nodded, her breathing uneven. Thank you. She took her mother-in-law's hand. Once I know for sure, I'll tell Seethan. Of course, dear, Veda answered, patting her hand as a knock sounded at the door. Come in. The doctor walked in and greeted the women, then turned to Addie. What's the trouble? I think I'm pregnant, Addie answered. The doctor's eyes twinkled. Wonderful. He wagged his finger at her and dug in his bag. I thought that might be it. I brought a test up, just in case. Addie laughed mirthlessly. Great. She took the box and walked into the bathroom to pee on the stick. After washing her hands, she sat on the edge of the table and read the box. 3 minutes and she'd know the truth. Veda, Jean, and Poppy knocked and walked into the bathroom without waiting for a response. 3 minutes, she told them. We sent the doctor away. You'll need to go by there and let him know one way or the other, Veda said. Why did you send him away? We weren't sure how you'd react, Poppy said gently. Addie nodded. She glanced at the clock on the bathroom wall. 1 more minute and she'd know. I'm scared because being pregnant is so huge and the baby isn't human and my mom isn't here. Her voice had risen hysterically. Jean put her hands on Addie's shoulders and shook her just a little. Addie. Calm down, now. You're surrounded by friends, Seethan will be thrilled, and I'm sure he'll have the best doctors here for you and the baby." Addie nodded. She remained where she was sitting for another 2 minutes, then stood. Her friends watched her walk to the cabinet where she'd left the test. She looked down at it, glanced at the box, looked at the stick again, and turned around. "I'm pregnant." Chapter 7. An hour later, Addie walked to the doctor's room with Jean and Poppy at her side. Veda could see she needed some space and time with her friends, so she had excused herself with the promise that she would tell no one until Addie had told Seethan and they were ready to announce it. Addie's fear was palpable as she lay on the table during the examination, her friends by her sides. "Doctor, I don't understand. I couldn't be more than 2 weeks along, maybe 3. The doctor nodded as he finished the exam. "Everything looks great, Princess." He walked over and washed his hands as Addie sat up and adjusted the gown she had on, for modesty. The doctor leaned against the counter and looked at her. "Do you know anything about the gestation period of a dragon shifter?" "No. I'm human," Addie said. "I studied the cultures of the other kingdoms while in college, but I was never interested in anatomy of humans, let alone other species." The doctor chuckled. "Understandable. Well, the gestation period for a dragon shifter is only 2 months." Addie gasped. "Are you kidding me? I'll barely have been pregnant before this baby comes shooting out of me." "It's fine, Princess, don't worry," the doctor soothed, crossing his arms over his chest as he spoke. "I do have to be honest with you, though. I've never heard of a human having a dragon shifter, so the pregnancy may be a little longer than 2 months." "But you don't know for sure?" Addie asked, panic in her eyes. Jean took her hand to calm her, and Poppy perched on the bed behind her to rub her shoulders. "What's going to come out of there? A baby, a dragon, or an egg?" Again, the doctor chuckled. "You'll give birth to a baby, not a dragon or an egg. Except for the length of time, dragon shifter pregnancies and births are similar to a human's, a worse, or a witch's." Addie breathed a sarcastic sigh of relief. "Well, that's something at least." The doctor removed himself from his leaning position and dug through a drawer. He pulled out a handful of pamphlets and handed them to Addie. "These will answer a lot of your questions. I'll want to see you every few days for now, and then as you get closer to giving birth, we'll see each other every day." Addie nodded. "If I have questions or start freaking out about something, I can come find you, right?" "Of course, Princess. I'll be here whenever you need me." "Anytime? 2 in the morning?" The doctor smiled at her. "Of course." He turned to leave so she could get dressed but stopped and looked back at her. "A word of advice. Talk to the Queen Veda or perhaps Romy. Both have had successful pregnancies, Romy's only last year." Addie's brow furrowed. She knew she could speak to both her mother-in-law as well as her sister-in-law, but they were both dragon shifters who had given birth to dragon shifters. She was a human giving birth to a dragon shifter. This pregnancy was an anomaly, a first in the history of the world, as far as she knew. "Thank you, Doctor," Jean answered for her. He left the room and she turned to Addie. "Okay, I know you're freaking out inside right now, but it's too early to freak out. Let's get you dressed and upstairs." Addie stood and shrugged out of the paper gown. Poppy began handing her her clothes as she spoke. "How can Veda or Romy know anything about this pregnancy? I'm the first human to give birth to a dragon shifter." "But you're not the first human to give birth to a shifter," Jean reminded her. "I know a woman who gave birth to a werebear's child. The child was healthy and beautiful." "Could it shift?" "He could, but it was later in life than a normal werebear, and he stood upright more often than he walked on all fours like a bear. Other than that, there was no difference." Addie felt a little relief at this knowledge, but not much. Dragon shifters could fly. What if her child could shift but had no wings? Or what if he or she did have wings, but they didn't work? What if? She shook her head. No more of that, she told herself. She had to brace herself to tell Seethan. She began to plan a special dinner for him in her head as she and her friends left the doctor's rooms. I need to see Veda. I want to have a special dinner made for Seethan and me so we can celebrate tonight, Addie said in a hushed tone. Addie, if you don't feel like celebrating, you don't have to, Poppy told her. She flew in front of her and continued backwards as Addie walked. Maybe just tell him instead of pretending. Addie nodded. You know, I'm not unhappy about this. I mean, it was bound to happen. A baby is so exciting. There was a but in her voice. But? Jean prompted as they got on the elevator. But, Addie said with a sad smile, I'm terrified. There are so many what-ifs in my head right now that I'm surprised the top hasn't blown off. I think Veda will be able to answer some of those what-ifs. And, I'll call my friend who had the warbear baby. She can answer a few more questions you might have, Jean told her. That would be great, Addie said as the elevator doors opened onto Veda's floor. Off to see the mother-in-law. See you later. That evening, Poppy and Jean helped her set up a beautiful dinner on the balcony of the rooms she shared with Seethan. With the help of his mother, who knew his favorite foods, she had organized a 5-course meal with the cooks. Veda had chosen specific servants, who could be trusted should they overhear the happy news, to serve them throughout the evening. For dessert, Addie had asked for a blank cake to be brought up to her, a yellow cake with chocolate frosting, Seethan's favorite, as well as a decorating kit. With the green frosting, not blue or pink for obvious reasons, she wrote Daddy in huge letters and would serve it to him herself. After her friends left, Addie dressed for the evening in a purple dress that fit tightly on her curves. Seethan's scales, when he was in dragon form, were purple, and Veda had commented that he might get so excited he shifted. Addie had smiled. She wanted him to be excited about their baby, even if she was a bit of a wreck emotionally. Veda had answered many of her questions and had promised to find a human doctor to stay with them until after the birth if that would make Addie feel better. She had nodded emphatically. She'd also asked if Veda could find a doctor who had delivered a cross-species baby, to which she agreed wholeheartedly. Veda's comfort, knowledge, and promises had eased some of Addie's worries, although she knew she would worry endlessly until the baby was born. Her what-ifs had grown from a handful to 100, or so it seemed. Poppy had suggested writing down the questions as they came to her so she could ask the doctor, Veda, or Romy, who would be at the castle in a few days. Addie had a pen and paper handy at all times and had already filled an entire page with questions. When she read them, though, she rolled her eyes at herself and crossed off some of the sillier ones, such as what if the baby is in dragon form and decides to eat its way out of my stomach? It was one thing to ask sensible questions, it was something else entirely to ask questions that were positively stupid. At a little after 6, Addie received word that Seethan was headed to their suite. She jumped up and rushed to the elevator with a glass of wine in her hand for him. She would, of course, be abstaining from alcohol this evening and hoped he didn't notice. When the elevator doors eased open, Seethan glanced up and started a little at the sight of his wife. She wore a short, tight, purple dress, her hair flowed down her back, and her face was glowing. His heart skipped a beat and his stomach fluttered as he looked at her, frozen. She held a glass of wine out to him as she stepped forward. Hello, husband, Addie purred, kissing him gently on the mouth. She held the wine up, and he took it without looking away from her face. I've arranged a lovely dinner for us this evening, out on the balcony. Seethan smiled slowly as he finally released his hold on her eyes and looked her up and down. Wow, baby. You look so beautiful. I'm a lucky man. Addie smiled beautifully. Thank you. I'm a lucky woman who felt like her man needed a nice dinner. Would you like to freshen up before we eat? I'd like to rip that dress off your body and ravish you, he answered, pulling her against him with his free arm, holding her tightly. His kiss was demanding and filled with desire, but Addie shimmied out of his arms and wagged a finger at him. My handsome man. I've gone to a lot of trouble for you tonight. Dinner first, pleasure after, Addie said with a seductive smile that promised an excellent dessert. Seethan grinned wickedly. Anything you say, my love. Let me change my shirt at least, then we'll have dinner. He handed her his wine glass. As he walked to the bedroom, Addie felt some of her stress melt away. He did that when he was around, erased her stress. As she wandered over to the balcony doors, she mused over the fact that no one had ever been able to do that just by being in her presence. She sat down and waited for her husband to come out. One of the servants stepped forward. Princess, he's going to notice you have no wine, so I brought up some grape juice until you've told him the happy news. He smiled at her and poured the juice into her wine glass. Addie giggled. You're a genius, Finian. She lifted her glass in a salute to him and sipped it. It's tasty, too. Thank you. Of course. When would you like the first course served? As soon as he sits down. I heard his stomach growling when we kissed, Addie laughed. And I'm starved as well. Eating for two, Princess, Finian said with a wink. You're right. Addie exclaimed, giggling again as Sethan appeared on the balcony. What are you two giggling at? He asked as he patted Finian on the back and kissed his wife on the cheek. Addie was at a loss for words, but Finian saved her. Well, Your Highness, I was just telling her a bit of a ribald joke before you walked in. You saved her from the punchline. Sethan laughed. She's a bit of a joke teller herself, Finian. She may even embarrass you. Addie slapped his arm playfully as he pulled his chair closer to hers. Stop telling stories, Sethan. People will think I'm a bad person. Well, Princess, you'd have to be a bit of a heathen to keep up with this scamp, Finian teased, and they all laughed as he topped off Sethan's wine. Shall I have the first course brought out? Yes, please, Sethan answered through the last of his laughter. The first 3 courses passed quickly. Sethan and Addie talked about their days, Addie letting him talk much more than she did since her day had consisted of baby news. She and Veda had discussed the coronation a little, so she filled him in on the plans for that. By the 4th course, they were telling stories about their pasts and laughing together at the funny memories of their childhoods. Okay, for dessert I have something very special for you, Addie announced as she rose to retrieve the cake. She had silently dismissed Finian and his helper, winking at them conspiratorially. I certainly hope dessert includes the 2 of us licking chocolate sauce off of each other, Sethan teased. Addie laughed. That's the after dessert. She winked at him as she turned to get the dessert. Sethan captured her hand and pulled her down into his lap before she could walk away. Call Finian to bring the dessert, he said as he kissed her soundly on the mouth. Finian and his helper already left, silly, Addie said as she pushed herself up and off him. I'll get the dessert. She bent at the waist and kissed him again before going inside. When she returned, she held a cake box with his name written on top in her large, cursive handwriting. She placed it on the table in front of him and gestured for him to open it. Sethan grinned widely. Are we celebrating something? It's not my birthday. His eyes widened suddenly. Is it yours? Addie laughed. No, but you really should know it. Do you know mine? Addie looked away playfully. Of course I do. He snorted. Sure you do. Addie rolled her eyes at him. Just open the cake box. Rather than look at the cake, Addie watched his face as he lifted the box. He glanced inside and read the message, looked up at her with a confused expression, then back at the box to read the cake once more. What? He asked. He looked at her again, a question on his face as a smile brightened it. When she nodded, he tossed the box on the table as he leapt up and crushed her in a bear hug. Addie, this is fantastic. You're pregnant? She groaned. Sethan, you're crushing me. He released her and stepped back, bending at the waist to touch her belly. She put her hands over his and smiled down at him. I'm pregnant. Just found out today. Today? Have you seen the doctor? You have to see a doctor, Sethan gushed as he rose to his full height to look her in the eyes. How far along are you? Can't be very. See then, calm down, Addie laughed. I did see the doctor and he says everything is fine. He says I'm 3 weeks pregnant. 3 weeks. That's fantastic, See then mused. He held her hands and smiled lovingly at her, quiet as they looked at each other. Then a thought crossed his mind. You must be freaking out a little. Addie laughed. She was surprised he would think of that. A little. I'm the first human to give birth to a dragon shifter, as far as we know. But your mom helped me a little, and she's going to bring in a human doctor and try to find a doctor who has helped birth a cross-species baby. That will make me feel much better. We'll have the best medical care here by tomorrow afternoon. You need not be worried in the least, Addie, See then assured her. Come on, let's get you to bed. I like the sound of that, Addie said, wiggling her eyebrows. The next day, Romy called to ask Addie to lunch. She wanted to take her to a cafe outside of the castle, which thrilled Addie. She hadn't been out of the castle much since she'd arrived because she'd been too busy planning her coronation and learning how to be a queen, which was surprisingly more work than she'd thought. Her mother had warned her. Romy linked her arm with Addie's as they walked out of the castle, followed by 2 bodyguards. Addie looked back at them and asked, Why are they following us? You're the new almost queen, and you're pregnant. See then is very protective of you, Romy said with a smile. No one knows I'm pregnant yet, Addie said, but I get it. So how far is the cafe? Not far at all, Romy claimed. We can talk on the way. We're less likely to be overheard as we're walking than when we're sitting in the cafe. Oh sure. See then said you're a little worried about the pregnancy and the birth, Romy stated, giving Addie the opportunity to continue the conversation. Yes, a little. First pregnancy is scary enough, but to be the first human to give birth to a dragon is incredibly daunting, Addie said, shaking her head. I bet it's like any other birth, Romy said with a shrug. She squeezed Addie's arm and smiled at her. Don't worry, Addie. My brother will have every doctor in the world here if that's what will make you comfortable. He said the same thing, Addie laughed. What was it like? When you gave birth? Romy sighed with contentment. Well, it was no picnic, I'll tell you that. But it was worth it. I'm sure. Addie did not sound convinced. Romy laughed. Honestly, it hurts, even with the drugs. And good Lord, girl, make sure you get the drugs. Addie laughed at her joke. With all the medical expertise my brother will have here for you, you'll be fine. Even if this is a first. Thanks, Romy. I feel a little better, Addie told her. She actually did feel a little better. As they walked in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, Addie thought about their decision to announce the pregnancy at the celebration after her coronation. She would, of course, tell her parents when they arrived, and she would insist that her mother make the trip back when her due date was imminent. Her mother had to be there, no questions. Addie's little chat with Romy over lunch made her feel even better. She told her stories of her childhood with Sethan as an older brother, and she told her about her child and husband. Addie loved learning about their family from someone other than Sethan. Romy told the embarrassing stories she could tease him about later. Addie returned to the castle much more at ease than when she had left it. Chapter 8. Rumors began to circulate that the princess was ill. She'd been seen going in and out of the doctor's rooms several times. Veiled questions were asked of both Sethan and Addie, but their replies were always vague or the topic was changed. Jean had intervened when Connell had asked if Addie was okay by flirting outrageously. His attention was completely stolen by her sweet beauty. Addie hoped a relationship might develop between them. Addie and Sethan asked those who knew about the baby to keep it to themselves. They had decided to make the announcement at the dinner after the coronation ceremony. And the 2 weeks before the ceremony flew by, planning taking so much of Addie's time that she didn't have any to be worried about the pregnancy. She saw the castle doctor often, and the doctor who had delivered a war baby with a human mother arrived. Together, they created a contingency plan for the birth and visited with Addie together. 2 days before the ceremony, King George and Queen Claire arrived from Lamina with much pomp and circumstance. They hadn't visited in almost a decade and were very excited to see how things had changed. Claire couldn't wait to see Addie. They hadn't been separated long, but Claire missed her daughter terribly. George was anxious about the visit with his daughter. She hadn't spoken to him since she'd left, only calling when she knew he'd be busy and avoiding answering his calls. Malik and Veda, Sethan's parents, waited with Sethan and Addie outside as the SUV drove up with her parents. Addie nearly ran to the car door as it opened and grabbed her mother in a bear hug as she alighted. "Mom." Addie breathed, so grateful to have her mother there she was nearly in tears. She leaned back and gave her mother a watery smile. "I'm so glad you're here. Baby, I have missed you so much," her mother said, tears in her eyes as well. Her mother looked her up and down, a question in her eyes. "You look different, but I can't figure out why." Before Addie could speak, George stepped out of the car. "Addie." He grabbed her in a bear hug, which she half-heartedly returned. "Hi, Dad," Addie said with a small smile for her father. George and Claire greeted everyone else, smiling and happy to see old friends and new. Sethan took Addie's hand and whispered, "You're really going to have to talk to your father about your anger." Addie looked at him coldly. "I'll handle my relationship with my father the way I want to, Sethan." Sethan chuckled quietly. "My love, you are so stubborn." Addie rolled her eyes at him. "Let's just concentrate on telling them the good news tonight." "Yes, dear," Sethan answered, his smile intact in spite of her glaring. "You're gorgeous when you're irritated." "Get used to it," Addie warned somewhat playfully. "The doctor warned me yesterday that I'm about to become a flaming bitch." "Why is that?" "Hormones. Can't wait." Addie playfully slapped her husband as they followed the crowd inside. At dinner, Sethan sat at the head of the table with Addie and her parents to his right and his parents to his left. He would have preferred entertaining in their rooms, but protocol required a more formal dinner, at least the first night. As the conversations ebbed and flowed around him, he wondered if, since he was king, if he could change that. But he knew he couldn't. Tradition was tradition, after all. But he didn't have to like it. Addie interrupted his thoughts by taking his hand and nodding at him. It was time to let their families know about the baby. Addie was nervous. Her mother would be thrilled, her father even more so, but not for the reason he should be. With this child, the alliance would be solidified. Their two kingdoms would be safe. A little bitterness had crept into Addie's heart about the situation. Sethan's comment about talking to her father had irritated her more than she wanted to admit. Sethan stood, pulling Addie to her feet as well. Everyone looked at them curiously, except Veda, who smiled knowingly and nodded encouragingly at them. "Everybody, Addie and I would like to announce that we're having a baby," Sethan announced with no preamble whatsoever. Gasps and ohs sounded around the table. George shook Sethan's hand as Claire wrapped her daughter in her arms, jumping up and down just a little. Malik waited his turn, holding his son in his arms and exclaiming how proud he was for him. George turned to Addie. "I'm so happy for you, Addie." He hugged her again, smiling down at her. "When are you due?" "In another month," Addie answered, removing herself from his embrace. "A month?" Claire nearly screeched. "But you can't be more than a few weeks along. Dragon shifters have a gestation of only 2 months. Can you believe that? How have I never known that?" "You lucky bitches," Claire said to Veda with a wink and a giggle. Veda laughed as well. "That's right. Be jealous." Claire shook her head and looked at Addie again. "I knew something was different about you. I'm so happy for you." "We're happy too, although I'm scared to death," Addie said. She took her mom's hands. "Will you please come back for the birth?" "Of course, sweetie, of course," Claire replied, squeezing her hands. "And Veda, I'll need you too, you know." You have been through it, Addie said to her mother-in-law. I'll be here the whole time, Veda assured her. She glanced at the men, who had ordered a round of scotch to celebrate. She rolled her eyes at the two women and smiled. We've brought in a doctor who helped with the birth of a war to a human mother. Addie is the first human to give birth to a dragon shifter. She'll be making history. Addie shuddered. The only history I want to make is a healthy pregnancy and birth. The men surrounded their women, and Malik boasted, Don't worry, daughter. We have the most experienced doctors here, and we'll bring more in if we have to. You'll be safe. Addie smiled at him. Thank you, Malik. C then wrapped an arm around her. We're so excited. We're making the pregnancy public at the dinner after the ceremony. Perfect. Veda said. Yes. King Eckhart and Queen Helene will be here for the coronation, so the alliance cannot be questioned after that, George said happily, dampening the mood of those around him. Addie glared at him and said, Well, I'm exhausted. Apparently, this baby thinks I need about 12 hours of sleep in a 24-hour period. Of course, Addie. We must keep you and that beautiful baby healthy, George exclaimed with a grin. Yes, Addie murmured, her tone indicating her irritation with the statement. She kissed her mother and mother-in-law on the cheeks and waved good night to her father and father-in-law. C then followed suit, and together they went upstairs for bed. 2 days later, King Eckhart arrived in a flourish of robes. A contingent of wizards and witches had come with him, flying in on their brooms, which Addie had known they could do but hadn't realized they traveled such distances in such a manner. When she'd asked, C then had explained that they actually just appeared outside the castle and flew in on their brooms for show. Well, it is impressive, Addie commented. She looked at the group of a dozen men and women in their robes. Which one is Eckhart? The short, fat one, C then said. The one surrounded like there's an immediate threat of assassination. He's a little ridiculous. But don't repeat that. Addie laughed and walked beside C then to greet the wizards and witches. She watched Eckhart as he spoke with C then. He was short, at least a foot shorter than C then and a few inches shorter than herself. He wore deep purple robes, indicating his status as the king of witches. Only the king or queen could wear that particular shade of purple and hex. He wore a trimmed beard that Addie would bet everything she had hit a weak chin, and his eyes, a light blue, were more creepy than captivating. Introductions were made, and when Eckhart was introduced to her, he held her hand longer than necessary. Princess Adelaide, it is a pleasure to meet you, he said quietly, almost as if he were telling her a secret. King Eckhart, welcome to Wyvern. We are pleased to have you here, Addie replied politely, although she did pull her hand away, a gesture he noticed and smirked at. So, you're to be the queen of this, he looked around distastefully, then back at her, lovely kingdom. How lucky for you. Addie had no idea what he was getting at, so she didn't reply. Instead, she looked to C then, who was speaking to a witch nearby. Eckhart took note of the deference. Does he control what you say? Addie smarted from the remark, but she replied in a diplomatic manner. We do not exert control over one another. We are equal partners. I bet, Eckhart retorted, trying to get a rise out of her. C then moved to Addie's side, sensing her discomfort. Eckhart, we've prepared a fantastic dinner after the ceremony. Addie and I would love for you and your friends to join us. The wizard smirked again. We wouldn't miss it. Has Helene arrived yet? She should be here any minute now, Connell spoke with a smile. Eckhart didn't bother to glance at Connell, only nodded and made his way inside. Connell watched him lead his entourage into the castle for the ceremony. What an ass. He'll always be an ass, C then murmured. Nothing you can do about it. A cacophony of howls, growls, and roars interrupted their conversation. C then turned around, directing Addie's eyes towards the hill, just past the moat of the castle. Dozens of whirs galloped down the hill, toward the bridge. Addie gasped at the beauty of the sight. She was awestruck by the sheer power of these creatures as they crossed the bridge at a speed she didn't think real wolves, bears and large cats could achieve. They're beautiful, aren't they? C then asked, watching with a smile on his face. The gray werewolf in the front is Queen Helene. Magnificent, Addie breathed. She nudged C then with her elbow. Almost as impressive as dragons flying overhead. C then looked down at her, leaned closer, and kissed her gently on the lips. Almost, but not quite. How you got stuck with me, I'll never know, she teased. A plain old human. Me either, C then said, frowning down at her and shaking his head in mock disgust. Shut up, Addie giggled, and he squeezed her hand in response as they returned their attention to the whirs. Oh my gosh, will they be naked? C then laughed. We need to make a trip to Lupguru. They never wear clothes, whether they have shifted or not. They're naked all the time? Addie asked in amazement. Then she giggled. What fun! C then hummed his response as the lovely werewolf shifted into a lovely woman, smiling grandly at the couple before her. Although she couldn't be more than 40 or 45, every hair on her head was the same gray as the wolf's fur she shifted into. Her face, mostly unlined, was hard to look away from, her beauty was so miraculous. Her gray eyes were almost silver and soul-searching. Addie fell in love a little with her. See then, Helene said as she stepped forward for a hug. C then hugged her and stepped away quickly, mindful of his wife's eyes on them. Helene smiled at him. It's so wonderful to see you. She turned to Addie. And this must be Princess Adelaide. Addie liked her voice as well. Melodic and deep, everything about this woman was sexy. Queen Helene, it's so nice to meet you. And you as well. Please call me Helene, she replied with a smile. I'm Addie. We're so glad you could come to the coronation ceremony. I wouldn't miss it. I've been waiting for C then to find someone to make him happy, and from the looks of the two of you, I say he must have succeeded, Helene told her. She returned her attention to C then and gestured to the whirs behind her, who remained in their animal form. We'll need a place to dress for the ceremony, but it won't take us long. Only 5 of my whirs will be joining me. The rest will stay out here, if that suits you. Of course, Helene. I'll have Conall take you up, C then answered. Addie and I have to get to the hall and make sure everything is ready. Oh, if I know your mother, and I think I do, I wouldn't worry one bit about that, Helene joked. They shared a laugh. Helene waved as Conall led them into the castle. After she was out of sight, Addie felt some of the stress leave her body. Wow. I couldn't take my eyes off her. I felt as if I need to please her, to make her happy, Addie said. Whirs have that effect on people. It's strange, but it's like their very presence is hypnotic, C then answered. I've actually gotten used to her, so I don't notice as much. How can you not? C then laughed. Come on inside before one of the males shifts. I'll never see you again, baby or not. The coronation ceremony was elegant. A special dress had been made for Addie, and subsequently had to be let out a few inches as her body changed so rapidly to accommodate the life growing inside her. Addie thought the dress looked more like a wedding dress in the loveliest shade of lavender. There were so many layers she thought she'd die of heatstroke. Luckily, she'd only had to wear it during the ceremony. As soon as she was crowned, she went upstairs and changed into her party dress. As she looked in the mirror while Jean adjusted her hair so that the crown sat on top as it was supposed to. The crown, or rather, tiara, was made of platinum and encrusted with diamonds and purple jewels Addie had never seen before. These particular jewels could only be found in Wyvern and were not allowed outside of the kingdom unless special permission was given. She'd chosen purple for the evening, a shade darker than lavender, that matched the jewels in her tiara. The dress was long and flowing, covering shoes she wished could be seen. They were so beautiful and added 3 inches to her height. Her shoulders were bared, and the neckline lower than she usually wore, but she looked stunning. She smiled at Jean, took her hand, and together they went back downstairs. Sidan and Conall were waiting for them at the elevators. Connell offered his arm to Jean, who took it with a little blush and headed into the hall, where dozens of tables had been set up around a large, blank area for dancing. When they announce us, we'll walk in. You're expected to welcome everyone, and then I'll say a few words. Want to announce the baby then? C then asked, looking down at her. Addie widened her eyes at him and took a deep breath. Sounds good to me. He leaned over and kissed her cheek. He brushed his fingertips over her shoulders, causing goosebumps to rise on her skin. She looked at him, and he whispered, "You've never looked more beautiful." Before she could reply, the announcer's voice called their names. King Cthan and Queen Adelaide. "Oh my God, I'm a queen," Addie mumbled, her eyes still wide. "Yes, you are," Cthan said as he escorted her into the room. The crowd was already standing, and the applause was thunderous. The people stood around tables, clapping and calling encouraging statements to them as they passed. Addie waved and smiled as they made their way to the front of the room where they would share a table with the other members of royalty, Addie's parents, King Eckhart, and Queen Helene. Addie hoped she would be near her mother. When they reached the dais on which the table sat, Cthan helped her up the steps. She turned to face the crowd and smiled brightly at them. Slowly, the applause quieted although everyone remained standing. Addie cleared her throat. "Welcome, guests. It is my honor to have you in my home. Thank you for joining us this evening." She looked at Cthan, who smiled. "My husband, King Cthan." "Thank you, my queen," Cthan said, and Addie blushed. She liked the title, even if she was afraid of what it meant. He lifted her arm and called, "Ladies and gentlemen, Queen Adelaide." More applause. "My wife and I would like to take this opportunity, while you're all here, to make an announcement." Murmurs in the crowd, some were making assumptions. "Queen Adelaide will honor me by giving birth to my child in 1 month's time." Deafening cheers erupted through the hall, people clapped and yelled. There hadn't been a baby prince or princess since Cthan had been born. The kingdom was ready to celebrate a baby. Cthan and Addie smiled and waved before turning to walk to their seats. After reaching their seats, Cthan yelled, "Let's eat." Laughter erupted at his informal announcement, but soon everyone was enjoying a scrumptious meal and gossiping at each table. Eckhart sat at his end of the table, seated at the far end away from the happy couple who were in the center. Helene was his closest companion, but she had been in deep conversation with Claire for several minutes. He eavesdropped on their conversation, and his irritation shifted to anger as he realized that Helene was actually happy for the pair. A child meant that the alliance between the humans and the dragon shifters was permanent, whether the marriage between Cthan and Addie lasted or not. That child solidified everything. Eckhart believed this was a dangerous development, specifically for his kingdom. The wizards and dragon shifters were natural enemies. He had wanted the alliance with the humans so his kingdom would be safe from the dragons. When Helene returned to her meal, Eckhart seized the opportunity and leaned towards her. "Helene, this is terrible news." She looked at him, her gray eyes questioning. "What is terrible news?" "This child." Eckhart sometimes believed this woman was an idiot, but then most were. "The child solidifies the alliance. This could be very dangerous for us." Helene tilted her head as she listened, her face a passive mask. "How is this dangerous, Eckhart? We are not at war, nor will we be any time soon." Eckhart shook his head. "Do you not pay attention to the report I've sent over?" "You mean the reports about the dragons gathering weapons?" "Those are false. Your spy, whoever he or she is not good at their job," Helene answered. Eckhart glared at her. "Don't let your friendship with that dragon shifter cloud your mind, Helene. They are dangerous." Helene, tired of his rant, leaned toward him and whispered quietly, "Eckhart, whatever caused this hatred you have for dragon shifters is clouding your judgment. You don't see what's in front of you." She turned away from him and struck up a conversation with Claire so she didn't have to speak to him. Eckhart rose from his seat suddenly, capturing the attention of everyone at the main table. See then, Adelaide, please accept my apologies. I must take my leave. See then rose as well. Eckhart, the party has only just begun. What could be so pressing that you would leave during my wife's coronation celebration? The insult to See then and Adelaide had been implied. Business, Eckhart answered curtly. Congratulations. I'll see myself out. Eckhart turned and walked briskly from the room. See then watched him leave. He caught the eyes of a security personnel and indicated with a nod of his head that Eckhart was to be followed until he left the castle. The man left with 2 other security personnel following him. He looked at Helene, who was frowning deeply. He leaned over and kissed Addie, reassuring her that everything was fine, that Eckhart was an ass and nothing to worry about, which elicited a relieved laughter from her. I'm going to sit with Helene for a moment, he told her as he kissed her gently on the lips. Lucky, Addie teased, and he winked at her as he rose and walked down the table to take the vacated seat next to her. What is going on with Eckhart? Helene smiled at him. You've never been one to beat around the bush, See then. You say what you mean. A trait I admire after dealing with a man so secretive. I'm pretty sure he forgets what he knows. See then returned her smile. What has he forgotten? He has forgotten that the kingdoms haven't been at war in decades. He fears this alliance you've created and sees it as a threat to his kingdom. The baby only added to his paranoia. Paranoia? What are you saying? I'm saying that Eckhart is losing his mind, Helene told him. I have spies hiding among his people who listen. He has done things over the last year or so that are worrisome, such as locking away his daughter, son-in-law, and their child. He thinks the couple are planning a coup, which is ridiculous. A coup? See then murmured. You're sure he's just paranoid? There's nothing there? See then, the son-in-law is a whir. He couldn't be king of Hex even if he wanted it. I've received letters from him. He wants out, and he wants to bring his wife and child with him. He's afraid Eckhart will kill all 3 of them. See then listened to the report, concern growing in his mind. He looked at Helene. What is your position on your alliance with him? Helene sighed. I won't break it, for now. However, if I continue to get these reports, I'll have to take action. Are you going to get his daughter and her family out? I can't right now. When I asked about them, he said he had put them in the tower to keep them safe. For now, I think they are, but he's becoming more unpredictable. See then nodded. If you don't mind, keep me updated. I do not want his paranoia to end in tragedy. Even more, I don't want him starting a war. Agreed. Chapter 9. Addie felt like an elephant. Her stomach protruded so far out in front of her, she couldn't see her feet unless she laid down and put her legs in the air, which she'd actually discovered was one of the more comfortable positions she could put herself in. Until her back started hurting. Then she'd have to call someone to help her up. In just a week's time, she'd gained 20 pounds. Her baby moved incessantly, and her stomach looked like a balloon with a declawed cat inside. She and See then would watch the baby move. Addie was a little frustrated because the doctors couldn't tell them the sex of the baby. They'd been receiving baby gifts from all their friends, from the higher-ups of the kingdom, and from the royalty in the other kingdoms. Opening the gifts had been so much fun, and choosing decorations for the nursery had been so much fun. But now, she was just ready to have her baby. She was irritable, which was Poppy's nice way of saying she was bitchy. She was uncomfortable and miserable and shared her misery with everyone. For example, See then had brought dinner up to their rooms the night before, a lovely lasagna the chef had made just for her since she loved it so much. Rather than being grateful, she had complained about not having enough cheese or that there were no tomatoes in the salad. See then had finally tired of her and snapped at her. She'd realized how awful she was being and had apologized. He'd forgiven her immediately and shared chocolate cake with her, which had made her happy. One afternoon, as she sat fanning herself in the coldest room on the planet, Jean walked in, a huge smile on her face. Addie glanced up as she bounced across the room, her happiness almost palpable. "You look happy," Addie observed dryly. "What's going on?" "Connell caught me in the hallway," Jean beamed. "He finally asked me on a date." "Took him long enough," Addie commented. "How exciting, though. Where is he taking you?" "He wouldn't say." "Somewhere outside of the castle," she told her. "That'll be fun." "When are you going?" "Tomorrow night." Jean sat down and clapped her hands together excitedly. "I can't wait. You and Poppy will have to help me choose what to wear." Addie smiled and shifted on the couch. She'd been increasingly uncomfortable all morning, which hadn't helped her attitude. But she was happy for her friend. Jean had developed a crush on Connell the first day they'd arrived, and she'd ridden his back after he shifted into a dragon. "You can raid my closet if you want, and you know Poppy will want to do your makeup," Addie said, shifting again as a small pain shot through her belly. She let out an unladylike grunt and leaned forward a little. Jean's attention focused on Addie. "Addie, are you all right?" Addie's hand rested on her belly, which had tightened considerably. I think so. I'm not sure." Jean moved to kneel next to the couch, her hand on Addie's belly. "Do you think you're going into labor?" "Well, it doesn't really hurt," Addie said. She looked at Jean, frowning as her belly tightened again. "Oh. Okay. That one hurt a little. Maybe we should go down to the doctor's rooms." "When is your due date?" 3 more days. "Babies come early all the time," Jean commented as she rose to help Addie to her feet. She gasped as Addie stood straight. "Oh no, Addie." Addie looked down at the couch. Where she'd been sitting was a huge pool of blood. She stretched her neck, the back of her dress was soaked. How had she not felt the wetness? Why didn't it hurt? She looked at Jean, fear in her eyes. "Jean?" "Okay, stay calm," Jean said, her voice quiet and serene. She held Addie's hand, easing her back down onto the couch. "You shouldn't walk. I'm going to get the doctors up here now. I'll call Sedan and Veda as well." Jean moved away from the couch, but Addie gripped her hand hard. "My mom isn't here. She is supposed to be here tomorrow." Jean nodded her understanding. "Addie, I don't think the baby is going to wait. Let me go make the calls, okay? I'm not leaving the room." Addie nodded and let her hand go. She put her hands on her belly and waited. She still only felt slight discomfort, not pain, but the bloodstain on the couch was spreading ominously. She closed her eyes and took several deep breaths. Panic was trying hard to get its grip on her mind. Jean returned to kneel beside her. "Is there anything you need?" Addie shook her head, gripping Jean's hand in a punishing hold. Jean didn't flinch. "What's happening? Is this normal?" "I'm not sure, Addie. I've never had a baby nor sat in on a birth." "The doctor is less than 2 minutes away," Jean reassured her. "And Sedan should be here momentarily as well. Call my mom when you have the chance, please." "I want her to get here as soon as possible," Addie said. "Of course. Now just relax as much as you can," Jean said. She was somewhat alarmed at the amount of blood pooling under her friend, but she couldn't show her fear. When a knock sounded, she shouted, "Come in." The castle doctor rushed in, followed by the doctor who had been staying here, the one who had helped with the birth of a war to a human mother. She knelt beside her on the couch. "Hello, Addie," she smiled at her. "Hi, Dr. Salen," Addie said. "Are we okay?" "Oh, I think so. We're going to get a gurney up here, which should be on the next elevator." "You don't need to walk or ride the elevator for that long," Dr. Salen told her. "Addie, are you experiencing any pain?" Dr. Moulton asked, checking her pulse with his large fingers. "Not really. Just uncomfortable," Addie told them. The elevator dinged and Seethan marched in, followed by Veda and Malik. He froze at the sight of blood, then rushed to Addie's side. "Addie." He kissed her, holding her face between her hands. He looked at Dr. Solan and Dr. Moulton. "Is she okay? Is the baby okay? What's going on?" Dr. Solan raised her hands and smiled. "Seethan, they seem to be all right. A gurney should be here in a second, and we'll get her down to the delivery room to check her out." Seethan nodded. He looked at Addie again, who hadn't taken her eyes off him. He could see her fear plainly on her face and in her eyes. He smiled down at her. "Don't worry, my love. Everything will be just fine." Addie nodded. "Please get my mother here." "Of course. And stay with me." The whole time Addie pleaded, holding his hand tightly. "I'll be next to you throughout, I promise," he answered. He kissed her gently as the elevator announced the arrival of the gurney. In the delivery room, the doctors checked Addie and murmured to each other in quiet tones. Their secrecy increased Addie's nervousness. She watched them and waited for them to speak to her about their diagnosis. While she waited, Seethan brought her a phone. "Your mom is on the phone, baby," Seethan told her with a smile, holding the phone out to her. Addie took it gratefully. "Mom, I'm in labor." "Seethan told me," Claire said. "Is Jean with you?" "What about Poppy?" "They're both in here, Mom," Addie said. "And Seethan too." She turned her head to the side and spoke quietly. "The doctors are whispering among themselves. It's scaring the crap out of me." "Don't let it, sweetheart. I'm leaving in an hour, so I'll be there in just a few," Claire said. "Seethan knows to send me updates regularly." "I love you." "I love you, Mom." "Please hurry," Addie replied, tears in her eyes. She handed the phone to Seethan, who sat it down and returned to her side immediately. "Baby, everything is going Addie interrupted him with a scream, clutching her belly as a gush of blood rushed out of her body. Seethan's eyes widened, and he jerked around and yelled, "Doctors! Help her!" They rushed over. Jean and Poppy hurried to stand by Addie's head as another scream ripped through her. After a brief exam, the doctors began tossing out orders at the nurses. The head nurse said to the trio, "Seethan, ladies, we're going to need the three of you to leave the room. Addie is going to need a C-section now." "A C-section? Why?" Seethan asked as Addie's grip on his hand tightened. "Are they in danger?" "Seethan," Addie whispered. "Please don't leave." The nurse looked at Addie. "Addie, we have to put you under. You're losing too much blood." Jean and Poppy kissed her cheeks and left the room. Seethan bent and kissed her lips. "I'll be just outside the room, baby. Everything is going to be fine." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I'm so scared, Seethan." "I'll hold your hand until you fall asleep." He watched as the nurse put medicine of some sort into an IV attached to Addie's hand. She became lethargic almost immediately. He kissed her again, just as her eyes drifted shut. The nurse bustled him out the door with promises that she'd call as soon as there was news. Seethan let the door shut in his face, then pressed his face into the wood. He'd never been so scared in all his life. She can't die, Seethan thought to himself. I love her too much. Seethan believed in the gods worshipped by the dragon shifters, and he begged them now to save his little family behind this closed door. Getting Addie pregnant had been dangerous. If it killed her and their child, he'd never forgive himself. He dropped to his knees, a sob escaping his lips. Jean and Poppy surrounded him, their arms around him as he cried. They cried and prayed with him as Addie remained behind the closed door, lost in the medically induced world of sleep. 2 hours later, both doctors stepped into the hallway, where Seethan, Poppy, Jean, Conal, and Seethan's parents waited anxiously. Seethan jumped up and moved so swiftly towards them that Dr. Solan stepped back. Malik put his hand on his son's arm to, hopefully, calm him. See then, Malik said quietly, but See then pulled his arm free. What happened? How's Addie? What about the baby? His rapid-fire questions in the tone he reserved for criminals frightened both doctors. Dr. Moulton touched Sethan's arm. See then, both your wife and your baby are fine. Addie had to have a blood transfusion because she lost so much blood. She'll be weak for a few days, but she's fine. What about our baby? The head nurse stepped out with a small bundle wrapped in a blanket. She handed the bundle to Sethan, who smiled so widely his cheeks hurt. It's a girl. She's perfectly healthy. A girl. Does Addie know yet? Sethan asked as his parents and Jean and Poppy surrounded him, making cooing noises at the baby. She isn't awake yet. Should be just a little bit longer before she comes out of the anesthesia, Dr. Solon promised. She touched the little girl's cheek. Nothing like a war baby or a human baby, I'll tell you that. Can I go in and sit with Addie until she wakes? Of course, Dr. Moulton said. Sethan smiled at his parents and Addie's friends. Isn't she perfect? She is Sethan, she is, Veda answered. Have the two of you picked a name for her? We have. This is Kalea, Sethan answered to the U's and ahs of his audience. That's lovely, Poppy commented. Veda said, it means filled with joy. And she always will be, Sethan swore. He smiled at the group around them and walked into the room to wait for Addie to wake up, cradling his precious daughter against his chest. Addie woke 30 minutes later and felt as if she'd been hit by a dragon. Everything hurt, but her mind immediately screamed for her child. In a panic, she whipped her head from side to side until she saw Sethan sitting in a rocking chair, holding a tiny bundle. Sethan, she murmured quietly. His face lit up when he saw her awake. Gingerly, he rose and walked to her with their baby in his arms, smiling so brightly Addie felt as if the sun were looking at her. She returned the smile. Boy or girl? Meet your daughter, Kalea, Sethan whispered. He leaned over so Addie could see her. She gasped in shock, and Sethan straightened. What's the matter? What's all over her face? Addie asked, appalled. She had expected a human baby to be looking at her, but this child had scales, beautiful, green scales, yes, but scales nonetheless. Are all dragon babies born like this? Sethan chuckled as he carefully sat on the edge of the bed. Yes, Addie. We're all born with scales. Just an indication that she is a dragon shifter. Actually, she's different. How so? She only has scales on her face and neck. The rest of her is just human skin. Quite plain, actually. He grinned at her as he handed the baby to her. The minute she held her, Kalea's eyes opened and focused on her. Addie's eyes widened in surprise. She can already focus? Oh yes. Dragon shifter babies are born able to do a little more than human babies, Sethan explained. He'd been studying. Is she hungry? Addie wondered, but her daughter's eyes drifted closed again. She'd made sure who was holding her and was content in her mother's arms. Addie looked up at Sethan. She's absolutely perfect, Sethan. I've never seen anything more beautiful in my whole life. She is perfect, just as you are, Sethan said, kissing her forehead. He looked into his wife's eyes and said, Addie, I was so scared when they kicked us out of this room. You were bleeding so much. My fear showed me the truth. The truth? I love you, Addie. So much, Sethan whispered, brushing a lock of her hair back. I can't live without you. I promise I'll protect you and our daughter with every last breath in my body. A tear slipped down Addie's cheek as she closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, Sethan could see the love shining in her eyes. Sethan, I love you too. Addie began singing a lullaby to her daughter, gently rocking from side to side, with Sethan next to her. She carefully scooted over on the bed so he could lay down next to them. He stretched out on his side and listened to Addie's lovely voice and the sweet breaths of his daughter. 3 days later, Addie was propped up in the bed she shared with Cthan, gently rocking a bassinet next to her. She cooed lovingly to her baby, the most beautiful creature she'd ever seen. She shook her head as she thought of all the ways this baby was different than other babies she'd known. For one, she was more beautiful, obviously, having inherited the best physical attributes of both parents. Another difference was the green scales. The scales were lovely, emerald-like, and Addie liked to run her fingertips over them when she caressed her child. At first, Addie had been frightened by them, but her love for her daughter overwhelmed the frightening aspect. And the scales had already begun to fade into her skin. The last difference had surprised Addie. Human babies, and were babies all nursed, drinking from their mother's breast the nourishment they needed. But dragon shifters did not nurse, rather, they craved the milk of goats and cows, preferably goats. Data had explained that dragon shifter babies also began eating regular food much earlier than babies of other species. As early as 3 months, in fact. Addie loved learning about her baby, and she smiled down at her as Kalea sighed in her sleep, making silly, adorable baby noises. Claire walked into the room quietly, a bottle in one hand and a tall glass of iced tea in the other. "Good morning, sweetheart," Claire said her daughter. Her plan was to stay for 3 more days so Addie's stitches could heal. She handed Addie the tea and placed the bottle gently into the bassinet. From her pocket, she retrieved the potion concocted by her friend, a witch, that would heal Addie's wound quickly. "It's time to put more medicine on your stitches." Addie set the glass of iced tea on the bedside table and squirmed until she was lying flat on her back. She lifted the hem of her t-shirt and relaxed as her mother gently slathered on the salve. It smelled of lavender and peppermint, an almost unpleasant smell, but not too terrible. "How are you feeling?" "There is magic in that potion, I swear," Addie said as the soothing salve eased the pain in her belly. "I could barely move yesterday, and the wound looked so angry. I couldn't even walk to the bathroom, but today, I've walked all over the suite." "Good. You'll be good as new in no time," Claire commented as she stoppered the bottle and put it back in her pocket. She kept it with her at all times. The potion was sacred to her friend, who didn't want the secret contents revealed. She looked down at her granddaughter. "How long has she been asleep?" "Only a little bit. I was about to take a small nap myself," Addie told her. "Good idea. A new mother should always sleep when the infant sleeps. Otherwise she never will," Claire laughed quietly. "I just can't stop looking at her, Mom," Addie murmured quietly, smiling down at the bassinet. "She's so freaking perfect I could just squeeze her." Claire laughed again, causing Kalea to stir restlessly in her bassinet. Claire covered her mouth with her hand to stop the noise. "Oops." Addie waved a hand. "She's a surprisingly hard sleeper. Cthan dropped a book yesterday and she didn't even flinch." "Ah, you'll appreciate that," Claire said. She rose to leave. "I put a bottle in the bassinet for her when she wakes. Take a nap." "Thanks, Mom," Addie said, pulling the blanket up. Claire leaned over and kissed her daughter's forehead. "I want to give Kalea a kiss, but I won't. I'll probably be back in 30 minutes so I can feed her. Have to get in my granny time before I have to go home." "Granny? That's what you want to be called?" Addie asked, her voice revealing her surprise at the name. "What's wrong with Granny?" "Nothing. You just don't look like a granny." "Maybe a Nana?" "I like Granny," Claire replied stubbornly. Addie giggled and put her hands up defensively. "Your choice." "Yes, it is," Claire replied, a smile gentling the words. "Go to sleep." Cthan held the phone to his ear, his eyes staring out the large window of his office as he listened intently to Helene's concerns. Eckhart has killed his son-in-law and refuses to allow his daughter and granddaughter to leave the dungeon in which he's placed them. "Cthan, I tell you, the man has lost his grip on reality," Helene huffed. Cthan imagined she was pacing, so great was her agitation. Cthan sighed deeply. What was his reason for killing the son-in-law? He accused the poor boy of treason, claiming he was a spy for you. But he was a were. Why would he spy for me? C then asked. Exactly my point, C then. It was a lie to give Eckhart the legal avenue to have the boy executed. And the man's family is in an uproar, demanding I find justice for their boy, Helene told him. And I don't blame them for their desire for justice. Do you have any idea of his purpose? C then had a good idea what Eckhart's final plan was, but he wanted to see if Helene felt the same way. C then, I honestly don't know, but if I were a betting woman, and I am, I would say he's planning to start a war with you and George. If that boy really had been a spy for you, that proves that you're being sneaky and underhanded. I will not go to war because that wizard has lost his mind. He's imagining things that aren't there, C then seethed, banging his fist on the table in front of him. What do you propose we do? Through the death of one of my citizens, Eckhart has rendered our alliance null and void. I'll be contacting him tomorrow morning to let him know my kingdom will no longer be allied with his, Helene answered, then sighed. That'll go over well, she joked rather sadly. It may push him over the edge, C then acknowledged. You'll have the support of my kingdom, should things get ugly. I will not go to war with that idiot, Helene swore. We'll have to find another way. C then was quiet for a moment. Helene, let me have a couple of days to think this over. In 2 days, let's hold a conference call with George. It's time the three of us dealt with Eckhart. All right, C then. Send me an email, let me know what time, Helene said. And now that business is concluded, how is that beautiful baby girl of yours? Eckhart paced his throne room, growling at anyone who came near him. He had already turned 3 of his advisors into animals out of anger when they disagreed with him, one a duck, one a weasel, and the third a snake. After his chief of staff had returned them to their proper form, she had told the 3 of them to leave the room and give the king his space. Crashes and loud booms were heard throughout the afternoon, and word spread, Queen Helene had ended the alliance because of the execution of the were. After silence had reigned for over an hour, the 3 wizards who functioned as King Eckhart's advisors were ordered to return. The chief of staff, a lovely witch with golden hair, sat by his side, unperturbed by Eckhart's behavior. She had watched him destroy everything in the throne room and had cleaned up before calling the others in. King Eckhart has developed a plan for this outrage Queen Helene has committed against him, the which began as the advisors took their seats across from the king. She remained standing to his right and just behind him. Your Highness, we are eager to hear your plan, one of them said. Eckhart cleared his throat for emphasis and smiled a smile that put fear into the hearts of all 3 men. We are going to kidnap the dragon shifter / human creature and dispose of it. It's an abomination. No one spoke. One of the advisors looked at the witch, who nodded her head, indicating her agreement with this plan. The 3 exchanged looks of horror. To argue with the king could mean another spell against them. Defending yourself against the king was considered treason, a law Eckhart had created the first year of his rule. Although all 3 of them thought the plan was positively horrendous, none of them spoke against it. Eckhart smiled at what he assumed was their agreement. Only the 5 of us will know about this plan. Gert will execute the plan. One of the wizards looked up at her, astonished. You're going to kidnap and kill the child? Gert raised an eyebrow at him. Do you have a problem with this plan? The wizard looked at Eckhart, who glared at him. Not at all. I just didn't know you did field work of this sort. I do whatever the king requires of me, Gert replied, staring into the wizard's eyes until he looked away. Chapter 10. Gert appeared in the hallway outside of Kalea's nursery. She'd been watching over the nursery for 2 weeks, keeping careful notes of nap times, feeding times, when Addie and Seethan sat with her, and what time they left her for the night. They had one of those walkie-talkie things that let them know when the baby cried through the night. Gert had noted that the child woke between 1 and 2 and again around 5, before waking up for the morning at 7. They didn't have a nurse, apparently. Addie or Seethan came in to feed the baby themselves. Gert was surprised. Royalty in the wizard kingdom paid women to take care of their children. A fairy popped in occasionally, one of Addie's friends, and Gert couldn't nail down a schedule for her. But she wasn't worried. Between the hours of 3 and 5, the baby was alone 5 out of 7 nights. She had turned herself invisible and watched as Addie fed the child, cooing and singing intermittently. Gert's lip curled in derision. She had no interest in babies or a husband or anything of the sort. Her life was dedicated to King Eckhart. Gert watched as Addie laid the baby back in her crib, smirking as the new mom kissed the baby's forehead as she snoozed, then lifted the rail to prevent her from falling out of the bed. Addie checked the walkie-talkie thing, speaking into it. Gert had to step closer so she could hear. Addie had said, "I love you," apparently hoping her husband was awake to hear her. The human giggled at her silliness, and Gert rolled her eyes. What an idiot, she thought. When the door closed behind Addie, Gert reappeared and moved on silent feet to the crib. She had decided to take the child out of the castle and drop her in the moat. The creatures there, although she had no idea what they were, would take care of the child. She would never be found, and no suspicion would fall on Eckhart or the wizard kingdom. Eckhart had wanted to take credit for the death, but Gert, after much arguing and discussion and broken tables, had convinced him that the other kingdoms would turn against them if he did so. He couldn't afford the other kings and queen to hate him. After waiting another 30 minutes to make sure Addie had gone back to sleep, Gert looked down into the crib, frowning at the child as she breathed the sweet breaths of sleep. She reached down and lifted the child into her arms, cradling her so that she didn't wake and make any noise. She smells weird, Gert thought to herself, grimacing at the sickeningly sweet scent the baby exuded. As she turned to go into the hallway to disappear so Addie or Seethan wouldn't hear the small pop created by the pressure, the door opened and Poppy, the little fairy, flitted in and closed the door. She hadn't seen Gert, so Gert magicked herself and the baby invisible and waited for the uproar to begin. When Poppy started yelling for help, she could disappear and no one would hear her. But Poppy froze when she turned. Witches could not magic themselves invisible to the eyes of a fairy without a special spell. Gert made eye contact and realized her mistake, but before she could disappear, Poppy blinked and the baby flew to her. Kalea woke with a sudden jolt and screamed in anger at having been awakened. Poppy blinked again, and Gert could not move nor perform any silent spells. As noises rang out in the hallway, Gert's only thought was damn it. Addie held Kalea close to her body, tears streaming down her face at the idea of what could have happened to her daughter. Seethan paced in front of the witch, whom Poppy still held frozen with her magic, her little arms folded across her chest and her eyes narrowed at the offending person in her sight. She recounted her tale to Connell and the head of security, who was devastated by this break-in and near kidnapping. I walked in to check on Kalea. This witch attempted to render herself invisible, but fairies are always able to see an invisible witch. Poppy smirked at the witch, whose name she did not know. I took the baby from her and froze her before she could move. She didn't even have time to speak. Addie sighed and took Poppy's hand. I'm so grateful you were here, Poppy. I hate to think what she might have done to my baby. That is the question, isn't it? Seethan mused, his voice dangerously quiet. He stepped in front of the witch and stared at her. She didn't flinch, she couldn't because she was frozen. She maintained eye contact, completely fearless, as far as Seethan could tell. Who is she? Addie asked. She is Eckhart's right hand, Connell answered. Then that must mean Eckhart sent her, Seethan answered. His eyes hadn't left the woman since he'd walked in the room. Poppy, can you keep her here, but allow her to speak? Poppy smiled. Of course, Seethan. She blinked and Gert's head and face regained the ability to move. The witch glared at Poppy. You're not allowed to use your magic against witches, you little shit. Poppy laughed. That law exists only in your kingdom, moron. Why do you think the other royals have close, personal relationships with fairies? I'll have your head mounted above my fireplace, bitch, Gert commented as if she were discussing something as annoying as gum on her shoes. Enough, Gert, she then said. When she looked at him, she smiled. Hello, she then. What a pleasure to see you again. She then took a deep breath to control his anger. The need to shift and kill this woman was pressing against his heart like a hammer. Addie touched his arm, calming him further, though he did not take his eyes off the witch. Hello, Gert, she then replied after a moment of silence. So does the right hand of the king mean kidnapping? Gert refused to answer, silently staring at she then, a smirk on her face. She then returned her smile. Silence won't protect you. Gert smirked again. I need no protection. The only crime you're sure I've committed is breaking and entering. I was only holding the baby for a moment. She turned her eyes on Addie and sarcastically said, She's positively precious. Addie's temper broke. She handed the baby to Jean, who had just walked in, and walked over to Gert. She lifted her hand as if to slap her. Gert only stared at her. With hand in the air, Addie said, Tell the truth, witch. Were you going to kidnap my baby? Gert stared at her. Addie let her hand fly, snapping Gert's head to the side and leaving a red hand print on her cheek. What were your intentions? Gert let out a menacing chuckle and looked at Sivan. She has more balls than you do, obviously. Gert eyed Addie. Have your little fairy release me. I'll tell you the truth. No. Gert rolled her eyes. Just my arms then. I'm dying. Why should we believe that you'll tell us? Because I'm screwed regardless. If I go back without having accomplished my mission, Eckhart will kill me. Sivan and Conall exchanged a glance. Sivan asked, How do you know that? Because he told me. Sivan looked at Poppy and nodded. Gert flexed her shoulders and rolled her arms in their sockets. Thank you. Addie glared at her. So? Eckhart sent me to kidnap your baby and kill it. Various reactions crossed the faces and escaped the mouths of those present. Without the child, and with the devastation of losing her, your marriage would have disintegrated and Addie would have gone back to Lamina. You understand you'll have to pay for your crimes, she then told her. You will not be allowed to return to Hex. I don't want to go back, Sivan. I'll admit that I'm a bad person. I'll even admit that killing your child posed no moral problem for me. But I do not want to die, and that's what will happen to me if I return to Hex. You'll spend several years in the dungeon here, Conall told him. Addie opened her mouth, and he raised a hand to her. I know that doesn't seem like a lot, Addie. But she really didn't do anything. She was going to kill my child. But she didn't. We are not barbarians, Addie, Sivan reminded her. She will go to prison for the majority of her life. Addie stared at him for a moment, their eyes locked. Finally, she took a deep breath and nodded her head. Too bad. I've read about burning a witch at the stake, but I've never seen it. Gert cleared her throat. Ah, little princess, you would blanch at the first sight of blood. She looked at Poppy. You've been away from your people for far too long, fairy. With that, she disappeared. Poppy's eyes widened, Addie screamed in frustration, and Sivan yelled for the guards. I'm so sorry. I don't know how she did that. Poppy cried, near tears. Poppy, don't worry. She'll never be heard from again, Sivan soothed. Addie put her hand on Poppy's shoulder and squeezed, showing her she supported her. What now? Conall asked Sivan. We set up a meeting with George and Helene and discuss this, make a plan. Eckhart must be handled. George was furious. He sputtered curses and yelled incomprehensibly when Sivan, through a video conference call with Helene, explained what had happened and who was responsible. This is inexcusable. Something must be done about that mad wizard. Soon. George finally calmed enough to speak logically. I agree, George. He has gone too far, Helene added. But I do not want a full-scale war. How do we get rid of him short of war? Assassination. George smiled wickedly. He waved his hand dismissively. Although the idea is pleasing, I know it's not a viable solution. But I do like to pretend. C then chuckled quietly. Back in the old days, he mused, stroking his chin as if considering the option. George laughed with him, and the two men carried on a brief history of assassinations that Helene did not join. She was lost in thought, frowning and playing with a lock of her hair. Gentlemen, she interrupted. I have a plan that will dispose of Eckhart without killing him or starting a war. The two men leaned in closer to their screens to listen carefully. After she finished, all were in agreement. Her plan would work beautifully. Eckhart smiled as the three other royals walked into his throne room. According to Helene, who had spoken with him a week ago, the other two wanted to discuss a peace treaty that would last for centuries. She even told him they were willing to bargain with him to get him to agree to the terms. Gert had never returned even though Eckhart never heard any rumors of a witch breaking into the dragon shifter's castle to kidnap the child. He wondered what had happened to her. His most recent and strongest assumption was that she had not been able to go through with it and had disappeared to avoid his wrath. Smart woman, he mused as the trio reached him. Welcome, royals, he gushed as he rose. Let's retire to my private chambers, just the four of us, and we'll work out this peace treaty. C then spoke up. Actually, Eckhart, we prefer to remain in the throne room with witnesses. Witnesses? Eckhart asked. He looked around and realized that the audience balconies were slowly filling. And if he wasn't mistaken, these were not just wizards and witches, but wers, humans, and dragon shifters as well. What is this? Eckhart, we're here today to discuss with you your abdication of the throne, Helene said, her voice carrying over the noise of the crowd, which hushed instantly. Abdication? I have no such plans and cannot be forced to do so, Eckhart told them, his face reddening as his anger began to grow. You're right, Eckhart, we can't, George said to him, stepping forward and to the side to reveal a young woman holding a toddler behind him. Your fellow wizards and witches can. Sybil? How did you get out of the dungeon? Eckhart blustered. His daughter glared at him. The witches and wizards have spoken, father. They no longer wish for you to be their king. And who is to stand in my place? You? You're nothing. You have no power, Eckhart claimed with a sneer. Sybil handed the child to George, who tickled his chin. Eckhart yelled, Do not let that human touch my grandson. You have no right to make such demands, Sybil said as she moved forward. The other royals stepped back into the crowd and watched. I am the king. You are nothing but a woman who married a were, Eckhart insulted. You forced that marriage on me, waited for me to care for the man, and then you killed him, Sybil reminded him. And you are no longer the king. I am the king. Eckhart screamed. He withdrew a wand and pointed it at his daughter, screaming a spell. Sybil deflected the spell with a thought. You just tried to kill your own daughter. What have you become? More than you will ever be, traitor, he screamed again. He flicked his wrist, but again, whatever Eckhart had meant to happen, did not. Sybil smiled. Father, you are finished. You can't beat me, and the witches and wizards of Hex will back me. Eckhart looked at the other royals. Helene, we have been allies for over a decade. Will you let this harlot dethrone me? Helene moved to stand beside Sybil. I'm sorry, Eckhart. You've made some very poor decisions in the last year, decisions that show me you are no longer a man who can rule. What decisions? Helene tilted her head and arched an eyebrow. Eckhart, it would be best if the circumstances of Gert's disappearance stay between the royals. Eckhart sneered at her veiled threat. He looked around at the audience and saw not one friendly face. His attention returned to his daughter. Sybil, this isn't the end of this. You may have won this day, but I will return and I will reclaim my throne. You can try, father. You will fail. Sybil looked at the guards behind her and nodded. They approached Eckhart, who lifted his wand. Sybil removed it from his hand and caught it as it flew through the air. Father, you are being stripped of your magic for the time being. You are a danger to yourself, your family, and this kingdom. She murmured a spell, and Eckhart screamed as if he was in pain and dropped to his knees. As the guards lifted him off his knees and escorted him from the throne room, Eckhart screamed insults at all of them. He spoke spells that didn't work, and before the door could close behind him, he had been reduced to sobs. Sybil, who had stood erect and strong throughout the confrontation with her father, now allowed her shoulders to slump and a tear to slip down her cheeks. Helene held her in her arms as she cried silently for just a moment. She lifted her head, wiped her face, and took a deep breath. Helene murmured to her, and she nodded her head. Helene's voice interrupted the quiet mumblings of the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, Queen Sybil of Hex. Cheers erupted. Cethan and George smiled at each other as the two women held hands and smiled broadly at the audience. Addie was waiting impatiently with a sleeping Kalea in her arms when Cethan returned in the middle of that night. She rushed to him so he could hug her and Kalea in his comforting arms. I'm so glad you're back. I've been worried sick about this since you left. Cethan kissed his sleeping daughter's forehead and his wife's lips. I missed you, my love. Did everything go according to plan? Cethan had explained Helene's idea to Addie before he had left. Exactly as Helene assumed it would. Using her spy network, she had found out a long time ago that the witches and wizards were sick of Eckhart and his machinations. They wanted a new ruler, and with the execution of her husband and her continued imprisonment, Sybil won the support of her people. She will be officially crowned queen in 2 days. That's great, Addie smiled. We'll have to go visit her when Kalea is a little older. Of course we will, Cethan said. They'd been riding the elevator up as they'd been talking. Addie hadn't been able to leave Kalea alone in her nursery since the witch's appearance. Either she had slept in the nursery or brought Kalea into their room with her. Tonight, Veda met them when the elevator doors opened. Let me take her tonight, Addie. You need to spend time with your husband, Veda said with a wink. Addie smiled and relinquished her daughter to her grandmother. She kissed Kalea gently on the forehead. Thank you, Veda. Thanks, Mom, Cethan said. He kissed his daughter and his mother. Good night. I'll stay with her the whole night, Addie, I promise, Veda said when Addie opened her mouth to speak. She walked into the elevator and left. Cethan took Addie into her arms and kissed her on the lips. The kiss deepened quickly until their hearts were beating uncontrollably and their breaths were near pants. The end.